We see the Netherlands today as a place of serene canals and meticulously arranged tulip fields, a landscape of placid order and quiet ingenuity. It feels ancient and peaceful, as if it were always meant to be this way. But beneath the placid surface of the water and the neat cobblestones of Amsterdam lies a secret, a paradox that sits at the very heart of this nation's story. How is it that a modern nation so associated with tolerance and peace was forged in one of the longest, most brutal, and seemingly hopeless wars of religion and rebellion in European history? How did a tiny, waterlogged collection of swamps and reclaimed land, a territory that looks more like a geographical afterthought than a global power, manage to defy and ultimately break the will of the 16th century's undisputed superpower, the mighty Spanish Empire? This nation's birth was not a gentle affair. It was an 80-year storm of breathtaking violence, astounding courage, and desperate gambles. I'm glad you're here. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I love to see where in the world you're tuning in from, so feel free to leave your city or country and the time of night in the comments below. Our story begins not with a throne or a crown, but with the land itself. To understand the Dutch, you must first understand their centuries-long struggle, not with kings, but with the sea. The Low Countries, as the region was aptly named, were a precarious place. A delta of rivers like the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt, constantly threatening to swallow the ground from beneath their feet. For generations, the people who lived here were engaged in a colossal work of engineering, building dikes to hold back the punishing North Sea, draining lakes to create new land they called polders, and connecting their towns with a web of canals. This constant communal battle against the water forged a unique character. These were not the feudal peasants of France or the courtly nobles of Spain. They were pragmatic, fiercely independent, and understood that survival depended on cooperation and ingenuity. Their world was flat, both geographically and socially, and their wealth came not from sprawling agricultural estates, but from the bustling ports of cities like Antwerp, Bruges, and Amsterdam. In the mid-16th century, this collection of 17 distinct provinces was the glittering jewel in the vast crown of the Habsburg Empire, ruled by Emperor Charles I. For Charles, this was personal. He had been born and raised in the Low Countries, in the city of Ghent. He spoke the language, understood the people, and respected their long-held local customs and privileges. But when Charles abdicated in 1556, this precious inheritance passed to his son, Philip II of Spain. And for Philip, the Low Countries were something else entirely. He was a Spaniard, through and through. He ruled his global empire from a grim monastic palace outside Madrid, a man of devout, unbending Catholic faith, and an obsession with centralized control. He saw the industrious cities of the north not as a homeland to be nurtured, but as a treasury to be milked, a source of endless taxes to fund Spain's sprawling military ambitions. Worse still, in Philip's eyes, this rich land was becoming dangerously infected with a spiritual disease. The Protestant Reformation had swept across Northern Europe, and its ideas found fertile ground in the independent-minded cities of the Netherlands. The teachings of John Calvin, in particular, resonated with the urban merchant classes. Calvinism was a faith that emphasized hard work, sobriety, and a direct personal relationship with God, free from the opulent hierarchy of the Catholic Church. For Philip, who saw himself as the divine sword of Catholicism, this heresy was intolerable. He intensified the work of the Inquisition, a religious police force tasked with hunting down and eradicating Protestantism. Men and women were arrested on suspicion, their property confiscated, and those who refused to recant their faith were publicly and agonizingly executed, often by being burned at the stake. An atmosphere of fear and resentment began to simmer just beneath the surface of daily life. Caught in the middle of this growing storm was a man named William, Prince of Orange. William was one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in the provinces, a man who had at first been a trusted courtier of both Charles V and Philip II. He was no religious firebrand. He was a pragmatist, a political operator who believed in compromise and a degree of religious tolerance, if only for the sake of peace and good business. But as he watched Philip's government chip away at the traditional rights of the nobility, impose crushing taxes, and unleash the terror of the Inquisition upon his people, his loyalty began to fray. He earned the nickname William the Silent, not because he was quiet, but because he was a master of political discretion, rarely revealing his true thoughts as he navigated the treacherous currents of the Spanish court. The simmering pot finally boiled over in the summer of 1566. Spurred on by fiery open-air sermons by Calvinist preachers, a wave of religious fury erupted. Mobs of Protestant zealots, enraged by what they saw as the idolatry and immense wealth of the Catholic Church, stormed monasteries and cathedrals across the country. This was the Bealden Storm, the iconoclastic fury. They did not loot for gold or silver. Their goal was destruction. They tore down statues of saints, smashed priceless stained glass windows, and defaced altars. For Philip II, watching from distant Spain, this was the final straw. It was an act of sacrilege and open rebellion. His response would be swift and utterly ruthless. He dispatched his most formidable general, the Duke of Alva, a man whose name would become synonymous with terror in the Netherlands. Alva arrived with 10,000 of Spain's finest veteran soldiers, an unstoppable military machine. He immediately established a special tribunal called the Council of Troubles, which the locals quickly and accurately renamed the Council of Blood. Bypassing all local laws and customs, this council began a reign of terror, arresting and executing thousands of people, from commoners to the highest nobles, whom they suspected of heresy or treason. It was a calculated campaign of shock and awe, designed to crush the rebellious spirit of the provinces once and for all. But it had the opposite effect. The brutality of Alva's regime extinguished any hope of reconciliation. William of Orange, having wisely fled to his ancestral lands in Germany, was now a declared outlaw, his lands in the Netherlands confiscated. From exile, he began to organize resistance, raising an army to liberate his homeland. His initial military campaigns were failures, easily crushed by Alva's professional forces. The rebellion seemed doomed. But the resistance found life in an unexpected place: the sea. A motley fleet of pirates and privateers, exiled nobles, and hardened sailors who called themselves the Watergozen, or sea beggars, began raiding Spanish shipping along the coast. In 1572, in a stroke of improbable luck, they managed to capture the small, lightly defended port of Brill. It was a minor victory, but its impact was immense. The capture of Brill gave the rebellion a vital foothold on land, a spark that ignited a chain reaction of uprisings in cities across the northern provinces of Holland and Zeeland. The 80 Years' War had begun. Historians still debate the true nature of the conflict's origins. Was it primarily a religious war, a noble struggle for the freedom to worship? Or was it fundamentally a political and economic revolt, a tax rebellion by a prosperous people defending their long-standing autonomy against an overbearing foreign monarch? The truth, of course, is that the two were inextricably linked. For the people of the Low Countries, Philip's taxes and his Inquisition were two sides of the same coin of Spanish tyranny, and they would now fight to the death to be free of both. Remember those sea beggars, the unruly pirates who had stumbled into capturing Brill? Their small victory had lit a fire in the damp, flat lands of Holland and Zeeland. City after city threw out its Spanish garrison and declared its allegiance to the rebellion and its leader, William of Orange. But this was not a coordinated revolution. It was a chaotic, spontaneous combustion of local uprisings. The great challenge for William was to somehow shape this raw, defiant energy into a functioning state, all while waging a desperate war against the most powerful army in the world. For years, the conflict was a brutal and grinding affair, a war of sieges and flooded farmlands, with atrocities committed on both sides. The fragile rebellion nearly collapsed on several occasions, but a critical turning point came in 1576, born from Spanish desperation. The Spanish army, whose wages had gone unpaid for months, finally mutinied. They marched on the city of Antwerp, at that time the wealthiest port in all of Northern Europe, and unleashed 3 days of unrestrained horror in an event that became known as the Spanish Fury. They murdered, looted, and burned, slaughtering thousands of innocent civilians. This shocking massacre sent a wave of revulsion through all 17 provinces, north and south, Protestant and Catholic alike. The shared trauma created a brief moment of unity. Representatives from every province met in the city of Ghent and signed an agreement called the Pacification of Ghent. For a moment, it seemed a united and independent Netherlands was within reach. All 17 provinces stood together, demanding that the Spanish troops leave their lands for good. But this unity, born of shared trauma, was tragically thin. The deep divisions between the staunchly Calvinist northern provinces and the predominantly Catholic, aristocratic south remained. Spain, recognizing this weakness, sent a new governor, Alexander Farnese, the Duke of Parma. He was not only a brilliant general, but also a master diplomat. He played on the fears of the southern nobles, whispering warnings about the radical Calvinists in the north and promising that Spain would respect their traditional rights and their Catholic faith if they returned to the fold. His strategy worked perfectly. In 1579, the southern provinces signed the Union of Arras, declaring their loyalty to Philip II and formally breaking with the rebellion. The dream of a united Netherlands was shattered. In response, just a few months later, the 7 northern provinces, Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Gelderland, Overijssel, Friesland, and Groningen, banded together to form their own pact, the Union of Utrecht. This was the true foundation stone of the future Dutch state. It was not a declaration of a new country, not yet, but a solemn military and political alliance, a pledge that these 7 provinces would act as one entity in matters of war and peace. pooling their resources to fight Spain until the bitter end. It was a messy, pragmatic document, a confederation that allowed each province to keep its own laws, religions, and customs, united only by the common enemy at the door. 2 years after forging this union, they took the final terrifying leap. In 1581, the States General, the governing body of the United Northern Provinces, issued the Plakat van Verlatinghe, or the Act of Abjuration. This was a document of breathtaking radicalism for its time. It was a formal, legalistic, and eloquent declaration of independence. It laid out a long list of King Philip II's tyrannies and concluded that, since he had failed to protect his subjects and had instead acted as a wolf rather than a shepherd, he had forfeited all right to rule them. They were, in essence, firing their king. This idea, that political authority, comes from the consent of the governed and can be revoked in the face of tyranny, was a political earthquake. It was a clear articulation of a revolutionary principle that would echo 2 centuries later in the American Declaration of Independence. But having fired their king, the Dutch rebels now faced a deeply awkward problem. They had no idea what to do next. The concept of a large, stable republic was almost unheard of in a Europe of powerful monarchies. They were convinced that to be seen as a legitimate state, they needed a legitimate monarch, and so they began a rather desperate search for a replacement, going on a kind of European tour of sovereign shopping. First, they offered the crown to the Duke of Anjou, the younger brother of the King of France. This proved to be a comical disaster. The Duke, arrogant and ambitious, quickly tried to seize more power than he'd been given, leading his French troops in a failed attack on Antwerp. He was unceremoniously chased back to France. Their cause suffered a devastating blow in 1584 when William the Silent, the one man who had held the fractured rebellion together through sheer force of will, was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic in his home in Delft. In their grief and desperation, the Dutch turned to their next best hope, Queen Elizabeth of England. She was a Protestant and a rival to Spain, so it seemed a natural fit. But Elizabeth was far too cunning to accept the throne of a rebellious province, which would mean all-out war with Spain. She politely declined, but agreed to help, sending money and an army led by her favorite, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. This too ended in failure. Leicester, like the Duke of Anjou, fundamentally misunderstood the Dutch. He was an English aristocrat, used to a deferential court, and he clashed constantly with the proud, independent-minded merchant oligarchs who actually ran the provinces. After 2 frustrating years, he too went home in disgrace. By the late 1580s, the Dutch were exhausted. They had fired their king, been let down by a French duke and an English earl, and their great leader was dead. It was in this moment of desperation and failure that they stumbled, almost by accident, into becoming the state they were perhaps always meant to be. They simply gave up on their search for a sovereign. They decided that if no prince was suitable, they would just have to rule themselves. The Union of Utrecht, that military pact, slowly morphed into a working constitution, and so the Republic of the 7 United Netherlands was born, not from a grand political theory, but from a series of pragmatic and failed alternatives. Its structure was a marvel of complexity, a political scientist's nightmare. It had no single head of state. Ultimate authority rested with the States General, But since every decision required unanimous consent, it was often paralyzed. Real power resided within each of the 7 provinces, and above all, in the richest and most powerful province, Holland, which paid more than half the Republic's budget. This unique, decentralized, and often maddeningly inefficient political creation was, on paper, no match for the centralized monarchies of Europe. Yet it was this very flexibility and resilience that would allow it not just to survive, but to achieve a golden age of wealth and power that would astonish the world. The accidental republic, born from failed job interviews with foreign kings, now faced the colossal task of paying for its endless war. Remember that Philip II of Spain wasn't just the king they had fired. He was also, since 1580, the King of Portugal. This was a catastrophic problem for the Dutch. For decades, Dutch merchants had grown rich as the middlemen of Europe. Portuguese ships would sail to the exotic East Indies, brave the treacherous journey around Africa, and bring back cloves, nutmeg, and pepper to the docks of Lisbon. From there, it was Dutch ships and Dutch traders who distributed these precious spices to the rest of the continent. It was a comfortable and fantastically profitable arrangement. But now, with a single stroke of a pen, Philip II had cut them off at the source. The port of Lisbon was closed to his Dutch enemies. The lifeblood of their economy, the spice trade, had been severed. It was an act of economic warfare intended to starve the rebellion into submission. Initially, individual Dutch merchants, in their typically plucky and decentralized way, tried to solve the problem themselves. Small competing companies were formed in cities like Amsterdam and Middelburg. They pooled their money, outfitted a few ships, and tried to make the perilous journey to the East Indies on their own, attempting to bypass the Portuguese middlemen entirely. Some of these early voyages were successful, returning with holds full of spice and making their investors fabulously wealthy. But most ended in disaster. Ships were lost to storms, wrecked on uncharted reefs, or captured and sunk by the Portuguese, who considered the Indian Ocean their private lake. The entire enterprise was a chaotic, high-stakes gamble. The competition between the different Dutch companies was so fierce that they drove up the price of spices in Asia, while simultaneously flooding the market back home, cutting into their own profits. It was inefficient, wasteful, and unsustainable. It was in this atmosphere of cutthroat competition and national crisis that a man named Johan van Oldenbarneveld, the leading statesman of the province of Holland, had a revolutionary idea. He saw that this disunity was a critical weakness. Spain was a unified global empire, and to fight it, the Dutch needed more than a collection of squabbling merchants. They needed a single, unified economic weapon. For 3 years, he cajoled, threatened, and persuaded the fiercely independent merchant houses and city councils. His argument was simple and powerful. Unite, or Spain will pick you off one by one. Finally, in 1602, the States General passed a charter that brought his vision to life. It created something the world had never seen before: the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company, known to history as the VOC. On the surface, it was a trading company, but to call the VOC a mere company is like calling a shark a fish. It's technically true, but it misses the terrifying reality of the creature. The charter granted by the States General gave the VOC a complete monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. No other Dutch citizen could legally trade in that vast hemisphere. But the charter went much, much further. It gave the VOC the power to build forts, to raise its own private armies and navies, to negotiate treaties with foreign rulers, to coin its own money, and to declare and wage war on behalf of the Dutch Republic. It was a private enterprise with the powers of a sovereign state. It was, for all intents and purposes, the world's first multinational corporation, and it was a mega-corporation armed to the teeth. Its financial structure was just as revolutionary. The VOC was the first company in history to be permanently financed by the sale of shares to the public. Before this, merchants had invested in single voyages, a short-term venture. If the ship came back, you got your profit. If it sank, you lost everything. The VOC, however, was a permanent joint stock company. Anyone, from a wealthy merchant to a humble shopkeeper, could buy a share and become a part owner of this colossal enterprise. These shares could then be freely bought and sold on the newly established Amsterdam Stock Exchange. This innovation allowed the VOC to raise an immense amount of capital, far more than any single monarch could, and it spread the enormous risk of the spice trade across thousands of investors. It was the birth of modern capitalism, a system of finance that would fuel the global expansion of Europe for the next 3 centuries. The company was governed by a board of 17 directors, known as the Heren 16, or the Lords 17. These men, drawn from the wealthy merchant elite of the major port cities, were the new kings of commerce. From their wood-paneled meeting rooms in Amsterdam, they moved fleets like chess pieces on a global board, their decisions determining the fates of thousands of people in lands they would never see. Their mandate was simple: secure a monopoly on the most valuable spices, break the power of Portugal in the east, and bring the profits home to enrich their shareholders and fund the war against Spain. There was little room for morality in their calculations. The men they sent out to Asia were not gentle diplomats or simple traders. They were soldiers and administrators, empowered to use any means necessary to achieve the company's goals. Historians have long debated the true character of the VOC in its early years. Was it a commercial body that was reluctantly forced to become a military power in order to survive in the hostile environment of the Indian Ocean? Or was conquest and exploitation embedded in its corporate DNA from the very beginning? The charter itself is ambiguous, a masterpiece of calculated vagueness. It speaks of trade and treaties, but it also grants the power of war and fortification. The truth may be that the Heren 17th themselves didn't fully grasp what they had created. They wanted profit, and they were willing to use violence to secure it. But it is unlikely they initially envisioned the vast territorial empire the company would eventually become. They set in motion a machine of commerce and conquest, a machine that would soon develop a logic and a momentum all its own, dragging the small Dutch Republic into a new and much darker role on the world stage. The little land of rebels and merchants had just unleashed a new kind of power upon the world, a corporate entity with the soul of a state and an insatiable appetite for profit. Its first destination would be a tiny cluster of islands, unremarkable in every way, except that they were the only place on earth where the world's most valuable spices grew. That machine of commerce and conquest, the VOC, now had its target. Its gaze settled upon a distant corner of the world, a place of myth and desire for Europeans, the Maluku Islands, the fabled Spice Islands of what is now Indonesia. And within this archipelago, the ultimate prize was an even smaller, almost invisible cluster of 10 tiny volcanic islands known as the Banda Islands. These islands, draped in lush green rainforest and ringed by coral reefs, were geographically insignificant in every way but one. They were the only place on the entire planet where the nutmeg tree grew. For centuries, the dried nut and the lacy red membrane that surrounded it, known as mace, were two of the most valuable commodities in the world, worth more than their weight in gold back in Europe, prized for their exotic flavor and supposed medicinal properties. To control the Banda Islands was to control the global supply of nutmeg. When the first Dutch ships arrived, they did not find a primitive wilderness inhabited by naive tribesmen. They found a sophisticated, cosmopolitan, and ancient trading society. The Bandanese people were not the ones climbing the trees to harvest the nutmeg. They were a proud merchant aristocracy who managed the trade. For generations, they had skillfully played the great powers of the region off one another. They sold their spices to Javanese, Malay, Chinese, and Arab traders, and more recently to the Portuguese. They were masters of negotiation and understood the value of their unique resource. When the Dutch arrived, demanding an exclusive contract, the Bandanese leaders saw them as just another new customer to be managed. They would smile, sign the treaties the Dutch put in front of them under the threat of cannon fire, and then, as soon as the Dutch ships had sailed away, they would continue to sell their nutmeg to whomever offered the best price, which was often the English, the late-coming but determined rivals to the VOC. For the directors of the VOC, the Heren Sitzdenend in Amsterdam, this was infuriating. Their entire business model was based on monopoly. Competition was not a healthy market force. It was a disease to be eradicated. For the first 15 years of the company's existence, they sent fleets to intimidate, build forts, and try to enforce their will. But the Bandanese, with the stubborn resilience of a people defending their homeland and their livelihood, continued their illicit trade with the English. The profits were good, but they were not absolute. A new, much harder approach was needed, and the man for that job was a bookkeeper with the soul of an emperor named John Peterson Cohen. Appointed Governor-General of the VOC in 1619, Cohen was the very embodiment of the company's ruthless ambition. He was brilliant, driven, and utterly devoid of compassion when it came to the interests of the company. He saw the East not as a network of potential trading partners, but as a future empire to be commanded from a central Dutch headquarters. He famously wrote to his directors in a letter that perfectly captured his worldview. Despair not, spare your enemies not, for God is with us. Trade in Asia must be driven and maintained under the protection and favor of your own weapons. We cannot make war without trade, nor trade without war. For Cohen, the idea of competing fairly was absurd. The goal was total domination. His first order of business was to establish a capital. He attacked the port of Jayakarta on the island of Java, razed it to the ground, and in its place began the construction of a new, fortified Dutch city, a slice of Amsterdam transplanted to the tropics. He named it Batavia. It would serve as the nerve center for all VOC operations in Asia for the next 300 years. With his headquarters established, Cohen turned his cold and methodical gaze back to the source of his frustration, the defiant Banda Islands. In 1621, he assembled a massive invasion fleet and sailed for the islands, determined to solve the problem of the Bandanese once and for all. What followed was not a war. It was a calculated act of extermination, a piece of corporate policy executed with military precision. Cohen's soldiers swept across the islands. He accused the local leaders, the Orang Kaya, of conspiring against the VOC and breaking their monopoly contracts. After a sham trial, 44 of them were publicly beheaded and their bodies quartered and displayed as a warning. The rest of the population was systematically hunted down. Those who were not killed in the fighting were driven into the hills to starve or captured and sold into slavery. The ancient society of the Banda Islands was effectively erased from existence. Of a population that may have been as high as 15,000, it is believed that fewer than 1,000 survived. The islands were now a silent, empty garden of nutmeg trees. Cohen's work was not yet finished. This was, after all, a business venture. He repopulated the islands with a new social order of his own creation. He divided the land into 68 agricultural plots, or perken. He then leased these plots to Dutch ex-soldiers and VOC employees, who became a new class of planter overseers. And to work these vast nutmeg plantations, the company imported thousands of slaves from other parts of Indonesia, from India, and from Africa. The monopoly was now secure. The VOC had absolute, uncontested control over the world's supply of nutmeg and mace. They could now dictate the price, and the profits that flowed from these tiny, haunted islands back to the counting houses of Amsterdam were beyond anyone's wildest dreams. Historians continue to grapple with this dark event. Was the Banda massacre an act of genocide? By any modern definition, it surely was. The more difficult question is one of responsibility. Was this the rogue action of a single, exceptionally ruthless governor? Or was it the logical, if extreme, conclusion of the VOC's entire corporate mission? The Lord 17 in Amsterdam received Cohen's reports. They knew what he had done. And while they may have privately blanched at the methods, they never punished him. They quietly accepted the results. The river of silver flowing into their accounts was too powerful to question its source. The foundations of the Dutch Golden Age were now being laid, but they were cemented with the blood of the Bandanese people. A dark and chilling secret at the heart of the world's first great corporation. The profits from Jan Pieterzoon. Cohen's brutal efficiency in the Banda Islands did not simply arrive in a treasure chest to be divided among the victors. That was the old way of doing things, the Spanish way of plunder. The Dutch had invented something far more powerful. This new wealth, stained as it was, flowed like a current into a sophisticated new financial machine being built along the canals of Amsterdam. A machine designed not just to hold wealth, but to multiply it, while the VOC's soldiers were building a territorial empire in the east. Its directors and investors were building a financial empire at home, an empire of paper, credit, and information that would make their small, damp city the undisputed center of the global economy. As the 17th century dawned, Amsterdam was exploding. It was the fastest growing city in Europe, a magnet for merchants, skilled artisans, and religious refugees from all over the continent. To accommodate this flood of humanity and commerce, the city undertook one of the most ambitious urban planning projects in history, digging out its iconic concentric rings of canals lined with the tall, narrow, gabled houses of the wealthy merchant class. The port was a forest of masts, its warehouses overflowing with timber from the Baltic, wine from France, and now the intoxicatingly fragrant spices from the far side of the world. But the true genius of Amsterdam lay not in its canals or warehouses, but in two revolutionary new institutions that solved the fundamental problems of 17th century commerce. The first problem was the money itself. In an age before standardized national currencies, international trade was a logistical nightmare. A merchant might receive payment in a chaotic mix of hundreds of different gold and silver coins, Spanish pieces of 8, German thalers, English shillings, French livres, each with a different weight and purity. Worse, many of these coins were clipped, with tiny shavings of precious metal secretly trimmed from their edges, debasing their value. It was a system built on uncertainty and mistrust. In 1609, the city of Amsterdam created an elegant solution, the Wisselbank, the Bank of Amsterdam. It was the world's first true central bank. Its function was brilliantly simple. A merchant could deposit his jumble of foreign coins at the bank. The bank's sworn experts would assess the real value of the precious metal in the deposit and credit the merchant's account with that amount in a new, completely stable and reliable unit of account, the bank florin. This new currency existed only on the bank's ledgers, a forerunner of today's digital money. But it was trusted absolutely, because everyone knew it was 100% backed by the gold and silver sitting in the bank's heavily guarded vaults. The city then decreed that all transactions over a certain value had to be paid by transferring these bank florins from one account to another. This masterstroke eliminated currency fraud, stabilized the money supply, and made Amsterdam the safest, most dependable place in the world to park your money. The second institution was even more dynamic. Remember that the VOC was the world's first publicly traded company. In the first few years, the buying and selling of its shares took place informally on a city bridge. But the activity became so frantic that in 1611 the city opened the Bourse, the world's first purpose-built, continuously operating stock exchange. Inside its large, open-air courtyard, a new kind of chaos reigned. Hundreds of merchants, brokers, and speculators gathered daily, shouting, gesturing, and making deals. Here, you could buy or sell not just a share of the VOC, but a fraction of the future itself. You could speculate on the price of grain 6 months from now, buy insurance on a ship that had not yet left port, or even engage in complex short selling, betting that a company's stock would fall. It was a humming, buzzing hub of information. A rumor that the Spanish silver fleet had been captured could send the shares of the West India Company soaring, while a whisper of a failed harvest in Poland could change the price of bread in Amsterdam the next day. All the violence, risk, and promise of the wider world was funneled into this one noisy courtyard and distilled into a single cold, hard number: the price. Together, the bank and the exchange formed a revolutionary financial ecosystem. The Wisselbank was the anchor, providing stability and trust. The Bourse was the engine, providing capital and liquidity. This system allowed the Dutch to mobilize vast sums of money with an efficiency that no monarchical state could match. The profits from a successful spice voyage, secured by the bank, could be reinvested through the exchange into a dozen new ventures, from draining a new polder at home to financing a shipment of Swedish iron. It was a self-perpetuating cycle of wealth creation. Historians have often wondered how this small republic, perpetually at war, managed to become the world's most trusted financial haven. The brilliant design of these institutions is only part of the answer. The other part may lie in a less tangible asset, a reputation for what the Dutch called soliditeit. It was a culture of seriousness, of honoring one's contracts, of paying one's debts. This reputation for sober reliability was perhaps the most valuable commodity of all. And so the great paradox of the Dutch Golden Age was complete. The most modern, rational, and sophisticated financial system the world had ever seen was being built. A clean world of numbers and paper contracts, resting entirely on a foundation of brutal, violent, and fantastically profitable colonial expansion on the far side of the planet. The astonishing success of the VOC, its shares trading at a frantic pace on the Amsterdam Beurs, inevitably led the merchants and statesmen of the Republic to ask a tantalizing question. If this revolutionary model of a state-backed, publicly traded, privateering monopoly could work so brilliantly in the East Indies, could the same trick be pulled off in the other half of the world? Could they create a sister company to wage war and seek profit in the vast Atlantic Ocean, the traditional backyard of their mortal enemies, Spain and Portugal? For years, the idea was debated and dismissed. A 12-year truce in the long war with Spain had cooled the appetite for such an aggressive venture. But when the truce expired in 1621 and the war resumed, the time was ripe. A new company was chartered, modeled directly on the VOC. It was called the West-Indische Compagnie, the Dutch West India Company, or the WEC. But this was to be a very different beast from its older, richer sibling. If the VOC was a merchant that had learned to fight, the WEC was a warrior that dabbled in trade. Its primary purpose, baked into its charter, was not commerce but conflict. It was designed as a massive, state-sanctioned instrument of piracy, a corporate weapon aimed directly at the economic heart of the Iberian empires. While the VOC dealt in the high-value, low-volume trade of spices, the WEC's targets were the bulk commodities of the Atlantic: salt from the Caribbean, furs from North America, and above all, the fabulously profitable sugar grown in Portuguese Brazil. To make this sugar empire a reality, the company would also need to control the supply of labor, which meant seizing the Portuguese slave trading forts on the coast of West Africa. This was the WEC's grand design, a three-pronged attack to hijack the entire sugar and slave trade, an interconnected triangle of commerce and human misery. Its most immediate and alluring business plan, however, was much simpler: robbing the Spanish. Every year, a heavily guarded fleet of galleons, the legendary Spanish treasure fleet, would haul the silver and gold from the mines of Peru and Mexico across the Atlantic to Spain. This silver was the fuel that powered the Spanish war machine. Capturing it would not only enrich the company's shareholders, it would cripple the enemy. For its first few years, however, the WEC was a bitter disappointment. Its raids failed. Its early attempts to conquer territory were beaten back, and its expeditions cost far more than they brought in. On the Amsterdam exchange, its shares sank, and investors grumbled. Then came the year 1628, and a man named Piet Hein. Piet Hein was not a typical admiral. He was not a nobleman, but the son of a sea captain who had himself been captured and forced to serve as a galley slave by the Spanish for 4 years. He bore a deep and personal grudge against the enemy. He was also a brilliant and audacious commander. That year, the WIC entrusted him with a massive fleet and one simple objective: hunt down and capture the treasure fleet. Hein sailed for the Caribbean and laid a patient trap. Through a network of spies and a stroke of good luck, he learned the exact route the Spanish ships would take. He managed to corner the entire fleet, slowed by its heavy cargo of silver, in the Bay of Matanzas on the coast of Cuba. The Spanish admiral, seeing the size and superior positioning of the Dutch fleet, made a fateful decision. Rather than fight a hopeless battle, he surrendered. In one of the most successful naval operations in history, Piet Hein captured the entire Spanish treasure fleet, its vast wealth of silver, gold, and precious commodities, without a single Dutch casualty. The news, when it reached the Republic, caused an explosion of joy. When Hein sailed his captured galleons into Amsterdam, he was greeted as a national hero, a symbol of Dutch defiance. The sheer scale of the haul was almost impossible to comprehend. The treasure amounted to over 11 million guilders, a sum equal to more than half the entire annual national budget of the Netherlands. It was enough to fund the Dutch army for the better part of a year. For the WIC's long-suffering investors, it was the ultimate jackpot. The company declared a dividend of 50%, and its share price skyrocketed. For Spain, the loss was a national catastrophe. The royal treasury was bankrupted. Philip IV was unable to pay his troops, and the Spanish war effort was dealt a blow from which it would struggle to recover. It was the most successful act of piracy in history. A corporate raid on a national treasury. This spectacular victory, however, masked a deeper instability in the WIC's business model. While Hein's triumph was celebrated, the company's directors were quietly pursuing the other, darker parts of their grand design. Their ships were raiding Portuguese possessions, not just in Brazil, but along the Gold Coast of West Africa. Here, they were not hunting for silver, but for control over a far more grim commodity. They systematically attacked and captured the Portuguese forts, like the infamous Elmina Castle, that served as the holding pens and trading posts for the transatlantic slave trade. The company was not seeking to end this horrific business, but to take it over. The capture of the Silver Fleet was a dazzling, one-time event, a lightning strike of fortune. But the slow, methodical, and deeply cruel trade in enslaved African people, that was a business that would provide a steadier, more dependable stream of revenue for decades to come. The WIC would never again reach the financial heights of 1628. It would live its life in the shadow of the Vaux Sea, a riskier, more volatile, and ultimately less successful venture. Its story defined by one spectacular heist and the long, grim business of human trafficking that paid the bills in the years that followed. The immense fortune from Piet Hein's captured Silver Fleet did not sit idle in the vaults of the Bank of Amsterdam. It was capital to be put to work, fuel for the West India Company's grand and audacious ambitions in the Americas. The company now had the funds to launch its projects on two vastly different fronts, establishing a pair of colonial footholds that could not have been more different in their nature, their climate, or their ultimate fate. One was a scruffy, pragmatic, and almost accidental trading post in the cold north, while the other was a vast, ambitious, and fantastically wealthy conquest in the tropical south. Both were experiments in empire, and both, in their own way, were destined to fail. The northern venture began not as a plan for a colony, but as a search for a shortcut. The company, like all its rivals, was still obsessed with finding a fabled northwest passage to the riches of Asia. In the process, their ships explored the great rivers of the North American coast, and while they found no route to China, they did find something almost as good: beavers. In the fashion-conscious capitals of Europe, beaver felt hats were the ultimate status symbol, and the deep, rich pelts provided by the native peoples of the Hudson River Valley were of the highest quality. Trade, not settlement, became the primary goal, and so in 1624, the Wik established a small fortified outpost on the southern tip of a long wooded island the locals called Mannahatta. They named it New Amsterdam. The story that the company's director, Piet Hein, purchased the entire island from the Lenape people for 60 guilders worth of trinkets is likely a myth, a neat piece of folklore that papers over a more complex reality of cultural misunderstanding about the nature of land ownership. New Amsterdam was never meant to be a pious religious refuge like the English colonies in New England, nor a sprawling agricultural society like Virginia. It was, from its very inception, a company town. Its sole purpose was to be a profitable trading hub for the WEC. As such, it developed a unique character. It was rough, transactional, and remarkably diverse. The company cared little for a settler's creed or nationality, so long as they could turn a profit. And so the muddy streets of New Amsterdam became a noisy, chaotic jumble of Dutch, Germans, French, Huguenots, Swedes, English, Jews fleeing persecution, and sailors from all over the world, alongside the free and enslaved Africans, who made up a significant portion of the population. At one point, it was said that 18 different languages could be heard in the taverns of the small settlement. It was less a nascent city and more a raw, sprawling, multicultural waterfront enterprise, a tiny 17th century preview of the New York City it would one day become. But for all its future significance, New Amsterdam and the surrounding colony of New Netherland were always a sideshow for the directors of the WEC. Their eyes, and the bulk of their investment, were fixed on a much grander prize far to the south. Their true ambition lay in executing the centerpiece of their grand design, the conquest of Portuguese Brazil. In the 1630s, using the profits from the captured silver fleet, the WIC launched a massive and costly military invasion of Brazil's northeastern coast, the richest sugar-producing region on the planet. After years of bloody fighting, they succeeded in capturing a huge swath of territory, including the important port of Recife. To govern this new and immensely valuable possession, the company made an inspired choice, appointing a German prince in Dutch service named Johann Moritz of Nassau. Moritz was not a typical company man. He was a true Renaissance figure, a soldier and an aristocrat with a deep appreciation for science and the arts. He governed Dutch Brazil for 8 years, a brief and brilliant period of flourishing. He rebuilt Recife into a stunning capital he called Mauritsstad, complete with botanical gardens, the first astronomical observatory in the Americas, and beautiful palaces. He promoted a policy of relative religious toleration, allowing Calvinists, Catholics, and a significant population of Jews to worship openly. He invited artists and scientists to Brazil to document the strange and wonderful flora, fauna, and people of the New World. The magnificent, vividly colored paintings of Albert Eckhout and Franz Post from this period provide a unique and breathtaking window into this lost world. But this enlightened surface, this tropical Camelot, rested on a brutal and unchanged foundation. The entire economy of Dutch Brazil was driven by sugar, and sugar was cultivated on vast plantations worked by the labor of tens of thousands of enslaved Africans. The Dubuque, under Moritz, became the largest and most efficient slave trading operation in the Atlantic, seizing Portuguese forts in Africa to ensure a steady supply of human cargo to the Brazilian mills. Moritz's beautiful city was built with the profits of this immense suffering. This grand colonial experiment, however, was living on borrowed time. It was fabulously expensive to defend against the constant guerrilla warfare waged by the Portuguese colonists. The Dubuque directors in Amsterdam, who saw Moritz's grand projects as extravagant and wasteful, constantly demanded higher short-term profits. Eventually, a frustrated Moritz resigned and returned to Europe. Without his leadership, and with the Dubuque unwilling to fund the costly war, the colony began to crumble. The two Dutch experiments in the Americas thus ended in failure. The grand prize, Brazil, was lost, retaken by the Portuguese, and the neglected northern outpost of New Netherland, seen as little more than a provincial fur station, was eventually captured with barely a fight by the English, who renamed its capital New York. While the West India Company's grand ambitions were crumbling in the Americas, a very different story was unfolding across the rest of the globe. The Dutch colonial experiment was not a monolith. It was a tale of two companies. And where the WC had largely failed against the vast territorial power of Spain and the resilient Portuguese settlers in Brazil, its larger, older, and far more powerful sibling, the VOC, was achieving breathtaking success. The target of this success was the Portuguese Empire, the oldest of the European colonial powers, and the original architects of the sea route to the east. For over a century, Portugal had enjoyed a near-total monopoly on the lucrative trade routes of the Indian Ocean. But their empire, once so formidable, was now old, overstretched, and vulnerable. And the Dutch, with their new corporate model of warfare and commerce, had come to dismantle it, piece by profitable piece. This global conflict, which historians call the Dutch-Portuguese War, was not a straightforward war between two nations. It began as a consequence of European politics. Remember that in 1580, Philip II of Spain, the arch-nemesis of the Dutch Republic, had also claimed the throne of Portugal, uniting the two crowns in what was known as the Iberian Union. For the Dutch, this was a strategic opportunity. Suddenly, every Portuguese trading post, every fort, and every ship on the seven seas was a legitimate military target in their long war for independence. It was a conflict fought not by national armies in Europe, but by the private fleets of the VOC and WIC in the faraway tropics. It was less a war and more a massive, hostile corporate takeover, waged over decades with the goal of stripping Portugal of its most valuable assets. The main theater of this conflict was the Indian Ocean, the VOC's domain. The first prize had been the Spice Islands, where, as we've seen, the Dutch had violently and successfully elbowed the Portuguese out of the trade in cloves and nutmeg. But the true linchpin of Portugal's Eastern Empire was the fortress city of Malacca on the coast of modern-day Malaysia. For over 100 years, Malacca had been the gateway to the Far East, a strategic choke point that controlled all trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. The VOC knew that to break Portuguese power, they had to take Malacca. After several failed attempts, they allied with the local sultan, and in 1641, after a grueling 6-month siege that left the city starving, the Dutch flag was finally raised over its battlements. The capture of Malacca was a strategic masterstroke. It shattered the spine of the Portuguese trading network and opened the sea lanes to China for the VOC. With Malacca secured, the Dutch turned their attention to another of Portugal's jewels, the island of Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka. Ceylon's prize was not nutmeg, but cinnamon, a spice nearly as valuable, and the Portuguese controlled its lucrative trade from a string of forts along the island's coast. Here, the VOC played a shrewd diplomatic game, forming an alliance with the inland kingdom of Kandy, whose rulers had been trying for a century to expel the Portuguese. The Dutch promised to help the king in exchange for a monopoly on the cinnamon trade. What followed was a long, brutal war of sieges, as Dutch forces, alongside their Kandian allies, slowly and methodically captured one Portuguese fort after another. The fighting dragged on for decades, but by the 1650s, the Dutch had secured the great port of Colombo and had ejected the Portuguese from the island for good, adding the world's cinnamon supply to their ever-growing list of monopolies. The same pattern was repeated across the globe. On the Malabar coast of India, Dutch fleets captured Portuguese trading posts, seizing control of the pepper trade. In the Atlantic, the Wik, despite its failures in Brazil, was ruthlessly effective in its campaign against Portuguese holdings in Africa. It systematically attacked and conquered the string of slave trading forts along the West African coast, capturing the infamous Elmina Castle in 1637 and the port of Luanda in Angola a few years later. The goal was to sever the supply of enslaved people to Portugal's colonies and redirect that horrific trade to their own. Why were the Dutch so spectacularly successful in this global campaign of dismantling? Historians point to several factors. The Portuguese Empire was a state-run enterprise, vast but thinly defended. Its chain of forts, stretching from Brazil to Macau, was like a long, brittle piece of glass. The Dutch, by contrast, were flexible, well-financed, and single-minded. The VOC could concentrate overwhelming financial and military power on a single, profitable objective, like the cinnamon of Ceylon or the port of Malacca, in a way the overstretched Portuguese state simply could not match. The Dutch model of a joint stock company at war proved to be far more efficient and deadly than the older feudal model of empire. They did not need to conquer vast territories. They simply identified the key economic pressure points of their rivals' network and squeezed, cutting the arteries of trade one by one. By the middle of the 17th century, the long and painful process was largely complete. The Portuguese Empire was not gone, but it was a shadow of its former self, a hollowed-out relic. The Dutch had become the new masters of global trade, their ships now dominating the sea lanes that their rivals had pioneered a century before. The vast river of wealth, diverted from the crumbling Portuguese Empire and channeled from the spice monopolies of the East, now flowed steadily back to the 7 provinces. This torrent of silver, pepper, cinnamon, and silk poured into the counting houses and warehouses of cities like Amsterdam, Delft, and Leiden. But what kind of society did this unprecedented fortune create? What was the ultimate result of all this corporate warfare and ruthless commerce? The answer is the period that Dutch historians call the Golden Eeuw, the Golden Age. For roughly a century, this tiny waterlogged republic, a nation born from a desperate rebellion, became the most prosperous, innovative, and artistically brilliant society in the world. To step into the Dutch Republic in the mid-17th century was to step into a world that felt fundamentally different from the rest of Europe. Elsewhere, society was a rigid pyramid with a lavishly wealthy king and a landed aristocracy at the top, and a vast, impoverished peasantry at the bottom. But here, the pyramid was turned on its head. The Dutch had fired their king, and their flat, damp lands had little room for a powerful landed nobility. Instead, power and status belonged to the urban elite, the wealthy merchants who sat on the boards of the VOC and WC, the successful lawyers, the powerful city councilmen. This created a large, confident, and remarkably prosperous middle class, a society centered not on the palace or the manor, but on the canal house, the counting office, and the workshop. This new kind of society created a revolution in the world of art. In Catholic Spain or monarchical France, great artists worked for the church or the king, producing grand, dramatic scenes of saints and mythology. But in the Protestant Netherlands, the churches were stark and unadorned, and there was no royal court to impress. The new patrons of the arts were the merchants and shopkeepers, and they wanted art to decorate their comfortable but not palatial homes. They wanted paintings that reflected their own world. And so, an explosion of artistic genius emerged to meet this demand. Painters like Frans Hals captured the boisterous, character-filled faces of the civic guards and merchants in lively group portraits. Artists specialized in breathtakingly realistic still-life paintings, celebrating the worldly goods that Dutch commerce brought home. A gleaming pewter plate, a half-peeled lemon, a carpet from Persia, and of course, a peppering of spices from the East. Others perfected the landscape, capturing the unique, luminous, cloud-filled skies and flat horizons of the Dutch countryside. And then there were the masters who transcended genre. There was Rembrandt van Rijn, the great poet of the human soul, who used light and shadow to create portraits of astonishing psychological depth, capturing the quiet dignity and weary wisdom in the faces of his subjects. And in the city of Delft, there was Johannes Vermeer, a painter of almost magical stillness and quiet. His paintings of domestic interiors, of a woman reading a letter or pouring milk, are masterpieces of light and texture, transforming mundane moments into scenes of serene and timeless beauty. This was an art not of gods and kings, but of and for the people, a celebration of the beauty and substance of the everyday world. This obsession with observing the real world extended from art into science. The Dutch Republic became the buzzing workshop of the scientific revolution. Its universities were the best in Europe, and its climate of relative intellectual freedom attracted great thinkers from abroad, like the French philosopher René Descartes. Dutch workshops produced the finest lenses in the world, which allowed Dutch scientists to see further into the heavens and deeper into the microscopic world than anyone before. The astronomer Christian Huygens used a telescope of his own design to discover the rings of Saturn and its largest moon, Titan. He also invented the pendulum clock, a revolutionary device that allowed for the precise measurement of time, an invention of incalculable value to a society of sailors and merchants. At the same time, a cloth merchant from Delft named Antony van Leeuwenhoek used his own hand-ground microscopes of incredible power to discover a hidden world teeming in a single drop of water, a universe of what he called animalcules, the bacteria and protozoa never before seen by human eyes. This intellectual ferment was made possible by a policy of relative tolerance. It was not a modern, principled stand on human rights, but rather a pragmatic recognition that it was good for business. Amsterdam became a haven for those fleeing persecution elsewhere. Huguenot refugees from France brought their skills in silk weaving and finance. Jewish families fleeing the Inquisition in Portugal brought their trading networks and intellectual traditions, among them the family of the great philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who would craft his radical ideas in the relative safety of the Netherlands. Amsterdam's printers, free from the heavy censorship of other countries, churned out books on every conceivable topic, making the city the intellectual clearinghouse of Europe. But beneath this glowing canvas of the Golden Age, a darker picture remains. The prosperity that funded the art, the science, and the comfortable lives was not created in a vacuum. The light in Vermeer's paintings was paid for by the darkness in the Banda Islands. The sugar that graced the tables in the still life paintings was grown by enslaved Africans in Brazil. The confident merchants in Rembrandt's portraits were often men who profited from the monopolies and violence of the VOC. The Golden Age was undeniably brilliant, a testament to the incredible flourishing of a free and prosperous people. But its gold was refined in the crucible of a global empire, and its shine often concealed the immense human cost paid by countless others far across the sea. The brilliant light of the Dutch Golden Age cast a long shadow, and in that shadow, a rival was stirring. The very success of the Republic, its overwhelming dominance of global trade, was bound to create envy and resentment. This challenge came not from the old Catholic enemies, Spain or France, but from a nation that was in many ways the Republic's twin, England. Across the narrow band of the North Sea, the English looked on as Dutch ships carried the world's goods, enriching the merchants of Amsterdam, while English ports languished. Both were Protestant nations. Both had challenged the authority of kings, and both were seafaring peoples. But in the zero-sum game of 17th century commerce, there was not enough room for two global freight haulers. They had been allies against the looming threat of Catholic Spain. But now that threat had receded, they became the fiercest of competitors. What followed was a series of 3 brutal wars, fought almost entirely at sea, a clash of titans for nothing less than the mastery of the world's oceans. The first conflict was sparked by a direct legislative assault. In 1651, the English Parliament, under Oliver Cromwell, passed the Navigation Act. It was a simple but devastating piece of protectionism. It decreed that all goods imported into England must be carried either by English ships or by ships from the goods country of origin. This was a dagger aimed straight at the heart of the Dutch business model, which relied on being the neutral, efficient middlemen for everyone else. The Dutch refused to accept it, and war broke out in 1652. This first Anglo-Dutch War was a learning experience for both sides. It was a chaotic series of massive fleet actions, where hundreds of warships and armed merchantmen blasted away at each other in the crowded waters of the English Channel. Great admirals like England's Robert Blake and the Netherlands' Martin Tromp became legends, maneuvering their vast fleets like chess masters. It was Tromp who was said to have tied a broom to his mast, a symbolic gesture to show he would sweep the English from the seas. In the end, however, the larger, more heavily armed English warships and their more organized navy got the better of the Dutch. The war ended in an English victory, and the Dutch were forced to swallow their pride and accept the Navigation Act. The peace lasted for barely a decade. The commercial rivalry was simply too intense, and skirmishes between the two nations' trading companies continued in the remote corners of Africa and the Americas. By 65, they were at war again. The Second Anglo-Dutch War would be the epic centerpiece of their rivalry. Initially, it went poorly for the Dutch, but the Republic found its savior in a man who would become one of the greatest naval commanders in history, Michiel de Ruyter. A brilliant strategist and a beloved leader, de Ruyter reformed the Dutch fleet, instilling new discipline and tactical innovations. He fought the English to a standstill in the brutal 4 Days Battle, one of the longest and bloodiest naval engagements of the Age of Sail. But his greatest triumph, and England's greatest humiliation, came in 1667. By that year, the English treasury was empty. King Charles II had laid up his main battle fleet in the River Medway, a tributary of the Thames, believing the war was winding down. It was a catastrophic mistake. De Ruyter saw his opportunity for a knockout blow. In an act of breathtaking audacity, a Dutch fleet sailed unopposed up the Thames. They broke through the defensive chain guarding the Medway and descended upon the English naval base at Chatham. The English were caught in a state of total panic and disbelief. The Dutch methodically set fire to the warships moored in the harbor, their cannons, now manned by Dutch sailors, firing on their own shipyards. As a final insulting flourish, they captured the pride of the English Navy, the flagship HMS Royal Charles, and towed it back to the Netherlands as a trophy. The raid on the Medway was a national trauma for England and a stunning victory for the Dutch. It forced England to the negotiating table, resulting in a peace treaty that was far more favorable to the Dutch. But the rivalry was not yet over. The Third War, which began in 1672, was even more dangerous for the Dutch. This time, England was not alone. The English king had entered into a secret alliance with Louis XIV of France to obliterate the Dutch Republic entirely. The plan was for a massive French army to invade by land, while the combined Anglo-French fleet destroyed the Dutch navy and enabled an invasion from the sea. The Republic was fighting for its very survival. Once again, it was Michiel de Ruyter who stood in the way. Though massively outnumbered, he used his superior skill and seamanship to fight a series of brilliant defensive battles. In encounters like the Battle of Texel, he managed to inflict such heavy damage on the Allied fleet that they were forced to abandon their plans for a seaborne invasion. De Ruyter's actions at sea saved the Republic. The English Parliament, deeply unhappy with the war and the alliance with Catholic France, eventually forced its king to make a separate peace. These wars challenged the popular idea that 17th century conflicts were all about religion. This was a new kind of struggle, a purely economic and geopolitical rivalry. And for a few glorious, violent decades, the tiny Dutch Republic proved it could not only stand up to its much larger rival, but on its best day, under the command of a genius like de Ruyter, it could humble it completely. While the great naval battles against England raged in the cold waters of the North Sea. The vast, globe-spanning machinery of the Dutch East India Company continued its daily, relentless work. The profits from Asia were the lifeblood of the Republic, funding its armies and its fleets. But this global enterprise depended entirely on the long, perilous sea voyage around the coast of Africa. This journey was a grueling ordeal that could take more than 6 months, a voyage that tested the limits of both ships and men. The greatest killer on these voyages was not storms or pirates, but a slow, insidious disease born of malnutrition, scurvy. For months on end, sailors lived on a diet of salted meat and hard, dry biscuits. The lack of fresh fruit and vegetables caused their bodies to waste away, their teeth to fall out, and their old wounds to reopen. Entire crews could be decimated by the time a ship finally limped into the port of Batavia. For decades, the VOC had recognized the need for a solution. They needed a halfway point, a place where their fleets could stop, rest, and most importantly, resupply with fresh water, meat, and life-saving greens. And geography offered one perfect, unavoidable location: the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. For years, passing Dutch ships had occasionally traded with the local Khoi people for cattle, but the arrangement was unreliable, and so in 1652, the same year the first great naval war with England broke out, the company dispatched a man named Jan van Riebeck with 3 small ships and a clear, practical mission. He was not sent to conquer a territory or build a colony. His task was to establish a permanent refreshment station, a maritime tavern and vegetable garden at the end of the world. Van Riebeck, a former company surgeon, was a sober and determined administrator. He and his small band of about 90 company employees landed in the shadow of the magnificent flat-topped Table Mountain. Their first tasks were not glamorous. They built a simple fort of mud and timber to protect themselves from the elements and any potential threats. But the most important part of their mission was horticultural. They immediately set about laying out a vast garden, the Compagnie's Tuin, where they planted the seeds they had brought from Europe: cabbage, carrots, and turnips, along with native plants. This garden was the entire reason for their existence. Its purpose was to create a reliable supply of fresh produce that could be used to fight scurvy and reprovision the exhausted crews of the passing VOC fleets. The Dutch had not arrived in an empty land. The Cape was the home of the Khoi, nomadic pastoralists who moved with the seasons, grazing their vast herds of fat-tailed sheep and long-horned cattle. The initial relationship between the Dutch and the Khoi was one of cautious, necessary trade. Van Riebeck needed cattle to supply the passing ships with fresh meat, and the Khoi were, at first, willing to trade their livestock for the copper, tobacco, and trinkets the Dutch offered. But friction was inevitable. The two cultures had completely incompatible views of the land. For the Khoi, the land was a communal resource for grazing, not something that could be owned, fenced, and divided. For the Dutch, private property was a sacred concept. As the small settlement grew, and the Dutch began to plant more crops and graze the few cattle they acquired, disputes began to erupt. The refreshment station was also proving to be less efficient than the Lord 17 in Amsterdam had hoped. The gardens were worked by company employees, men who were essentially salaried soldiers and sailors. They had little personal incentive to work hard or to improve the land. The yields were often disappointing, and so In 1657, 5 years after the initial landing, Van Riebeeck and the VOC made a small administrative decision that would have immense and unforeseen consequences. They released 9 company employees from their contracts and granted them plots of land along the Liesbeek River. These men, the first Fryburgers, or free citizens, were no longer employees. They were independent farmers, allowed to own their own land and sell their produce to the company at a fixed price. This was the moment that the simple refreshment station began its slow, almost accidental transformation into a true colony of settlement. These Fryburgers were not temporary residents. They were putting down roots. This was now their home. And as their numbers grew, their demand for land grew with them. They needed more land for their wheat fields and more grazing land for their cattle. Inevitably, they expanded outward from the shadow of Table Mountain, pushing into the traditional grazing lands of the Khoikhoi. The friction that had begun with minor trade disputes now escalated into armed conflict as the Khoikhoi resisted the encroachment on their ancestral lands. The VOC, a company that was obsessed with neat balance sheets and predictable profits, had unintentionally created a new, land-hungry, and fiercely independent society of farmers on the southern tip of Africa. The directors in Amsterdam wanted a cheap, contained, and controllable logistical outpost, but the small vegetable patch they had planted had taken root in the African soil and was beginning to grow into something far larger, far more complex, and far more troublesome than they had ever imagined. While John Van Riebeeck's men were methodically planting their life-saving cabbages and carrots at the foot of Table Mountain, a very different and far more frantic horticultural obsession was consuming their homeland. This story is not about sustenance, but about extravagance. Not about survival, but about a spectacular collective flight from reason. It's a strange and cautionary interlude in the history of the Dutch Empire, a moment when the sober, business-minded Dutch people were gripped by a feverish madness for a simple flower, the tulip. This was the great tulip mania, the world's first recorded speculative bubble, and a perfect storm of new wealth, exotic beauty, and human greed. The tulip was not native to the Netherlands. It was a recent and exotic import, arriving from the gardens of the Ottoman Empire in the late 16th century. With their intense, pure colors, tulips were unlike any flower known in Europe, and they quickly became the ultimate status symbol for the wealthy elite. A rich merchant would display his collection of rare tulips in his garden with the same pride he took in the fine paintings hanging in his home. But the tulips that drove the real frenzy were a special kind. These were the so-called broken tulips, flowers whose petals were streaked with spectacular, flame-like patterns of contrasting colors. A single stem might have intricate feathers of deep purple on a white background or vivid red flares on a yellow petal. What the Dutch did not know was that this beautiful effect was the result of a mosaic virus that had infected the bulb. The virus made the flower's patterns completely unpredictable and unique. More importantly, it made the bulb weaker and much harder to propagate. You could never be sure what a new offset bulb from a prized flower would look like, or if it would even survive. This combination of stunning beauty and extreme rarity made these broken bulbs the most desirable objects in the Republic. The most legendary varieties were given grand names, like the Viceroy or the impossibly rare Semper Augustus, of which only a dozen or so bulbs were known to exist in the entire country. At first, the trade in these rare bulbs was a hobby for wealthy connoisseurs. But in the 1630s, at the absolute height of the Golden Age, something began to change. As prices for the rarest bulbs steadily rose, ordinary middle-class people, shopkeepers, weavers, carpenters, began to take notice. They saw their neighbors making a fortune overnight, and they wanted in. The market began to accelerate wildly, because tulips can only be moved when the bulbs are dormant in the summer. But the trading continued year-round. The merchants developed a sophisticated system of futures contracts. People were no longer trading actual tulip bulbs, but signed pieces of paper, promissory notes for bulbs to be delivered months later. This trade in wind, as it was called, often took place in the back rooms of taverns, fueled by beer and herd mentality. By the winter of 1636, the situation had escalated into a full-blown mania. Prices reached levels that seem, to the modern mind, completely insane. A single bulb of a desirable variety could be traded for a whole team of oxen, 1,000 pounds of cheese, or a fully furnished bed. The most famous stories claim that a single viceroy bulb was exchanged for a package of goods that included 2 loads of wheat, 4 fat oxen, 8 pigs, 12 sheep, a bed, a suit of clothes, and a silver beaker. The rarest bulbs, like the Semper Augustus, were traded for the price of a grand canal house in the best part of Amsterdam. People sold family businesses, ancestral farms, and all their life savings to invest in a single, dormant flower bulb, convinced that its price could only go up and that they would be able to sell it to someone else for an even higher price in a few weeks. Then, in the first week of February 1637, the music stopped. At a routine bulb auction in the city of Haarlem, a seller offered a collection of tulips, and for the first time, no one in the room would meet his price. The news spread like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone seemed to realize at the same moment that they were holding pieces of paper for a common flower that were priced at a king's ransom. Confidence, the only thing holding the market up, evaporated overnight. Panic set in. Everyone tried to sell at once, but there were no buyers left. Prices collapsed, falling by 95% or more in a matter of days. Men who had gone to bed thinking they were rich woke up to find they were ruined, holding a now nearly worthless tulip bulb and a mountain of debt from a contract they could never hope to pay. Modern historians now debate the true scale of the tulip mania. The most dramatic stories were often spread by moralizing pamphleteers after the event, and it seems the crash did not, as was once believed, cause a deep and lasting depression for the entire Dutch economy. It was resilient enough to absorb the shock, but the mania was a profound social and psychological trauma. It was a moment of madness that revealed a strange irrationality lurking beneath the surface of the world's most rational and commercial society. The tulip mania became a legendary cautionary tale, the first and most colorful chapter in the long history of speculative bubbles. A timeless story of how the promise of easy money can make even the most sensible people do the most foolish things. The strange, feverish dream of the tulip mania eventually faded, leaving behind a hard lesson in the psychology of markets. But as the 17th century wore on, a far more dangerous and tangible threat was gathering on the Republic's borders. The golden age of Dutch prosperity and the nation's proud republican ideals had earned it a powerful and deeply envious enemy, King Louis XIV of France. The self-proclaimed Sun King was the embodiment of absolute monarchy, and he viewed the small, merchant-run republic as a bothersome anomaly, an insult to the natural order of things, and a direct obstacle to his own ambitions of dominating the continent of Europe. He was determined to humble this upstart nation of shopkeepers, and he began to methodically assemble a coalition to ensure its utter destruction. His first and most crucial move was to peel away the Dutch Republic's traditional ally. In a masterstroke of secret diplomacy, he signed a treaty with King Charles II of England, the very same rival the Dutch had fought in two brutal naval wars. The English king, in exchange for a hefty French subsidy, agreed to join the attack from the sea. Louis then brought in the prince-bishops of Cologne and Münster, German states that bordered the Netherlands to the east, who were happy to join in the hopes of seizing Dutch territory. By the spring of 1672, the trap was set. The Republic was surrounded, diplomatically isolated, and about to be attacked by the three strongest powers in the region from three sides at once. The invasion, when it came, was a terrifying shock. The massive French army, the largest and best trained in Europe, did not bother with the heavily fortified Dutch cities in the south. Instead, it swept around them, invading the Republic where it was weakest, from the east. The Dutch army had been shamefully neglected for decades. The powerful merchant regions of Holland, led by the Grand Pensionary Johan de Witt, had always prioritized funding the navy to protect their trade routes, seeing the army as a costly extravagance and a potential tool for the ambitious House of Orange. As a result, the Dutch field army was small, ill-equipped, and it collapsed almost immediately. French troops poured into the country, capturing city after city with barely a fight. A wave of pure panic washed over the nation. It seemed that the Republic, which had fought for 80 years to win its freedom from Spain, was about to be erased from the map in a matter of weeks. This moment became known in Dutch history as the Rampjaar, the disaster year, a famous saying from the time perfectly captured the national mood. The people were resolute, irrational, the government was redolous, desperate, and the country was redolous, beyond saving. In their terror and fury, the irrational populace looked for a scapegoat, and they found one in their leader, Johan de Witt. The brilliant statesman who had guided the Republic through its golden age was now blamed for everything, for neglecting the army, for trusting the English, for failing to see the danger. The cry went up from the mob to overthrow the Republican government and grant full power to the one man they believed could save them, the young, stern, and determined Prince of the House of Orange, William III. The political crisis reached a horrifying and bloody climax in August of that year. Johan de Witt had resigned, but the mob was not satisfied. When he went to visit his brother Cornelis, who had been imprisoned in The Hague on trumped-up charges of treason, a furious Orangist mob surrounded the prison. The civic guard mysteriously stepped aside, and the mob stormed the building, dragging the two brothers out into the street, where they were brutally lynched. It was a shocking act of political savagery that sent a tremor through all of Europe. Historians still debate whether this was a spontaneous act of mob violence or a carefully orchestrated political assassination, quietly condoned by William of Orange's supporters to eliminate their rivals. Whatever the truth, it was a brutal end to the life of a great statesman and to the era of confident Republican rule he had embodied. William of Orange was now in charge, but the French army was still advancing, poised to march on the heart of the Republic, the province of Holland and the city of Amsterdam. With the army broken and the government in chaos, William turned to a desperate last-ditch defense, a strategy that only a nation like the Netherlands could have devised. He gave the order to weaponize the landscape itself. The Dutch deliberately and with grim determination opened the great sluices and breached their own dikes. The cold grey water of the rivers and the sea began to pour out across the flat, low-lying farmlands. This was the activation of the Hollandic waterline. It created a vast, man-made barrier of water, a shallow lake stretching from the Zuiderzee in the north to the River Rhine in the south. It was too deep for soldiers and cavalry to wade through, but too shallow and filled with unseen ditches and fences for the French to use boats. The French advance ground to a halt just miles from Amsterdam. The water had saved them. Combined with Admiral de Ruyter's victories at sea, which prevented the English from landing an invasion force, the defense of the Republic was a success. The country had survived, but the trauma of the Rampjaar would never be forgotten. It had brought the Golden Age to a sudden, terrifying halt and left a permanent scar on the Dutch soul. The disaster year of 1672 had been a crucible, and it had forged a new kind of leadership for the Dutch Republic. The age of the merchant regent, led by men like Johan de Witt, was over, its end marked by a bloody mob in The Hague. In its place rose the stern, unsmiling, and formidable figure of the stadtholder, William III, Prince of Orange. William's entire political existence, his every waking thought, was dedicated to a single, all-consuming purpose: the containment of the expansionist ambitions of Louis XII's France. The Rampjaar had taught him that the Netherlands could not stand against France alone. He needed powerful allies. And he spent the next decade and a half masterfully building a grand coalition of European states to resist the Sun King. But he knew that, to truly succeed, he needed the one piece that was missing from the board: England. The relationship with England had, for decades, been one of bitter rivalry. But by the 1680s, the situation across the Channel had grown deeply unstable. The English king, James II, was a devout and open Catholic, a fact that made his overwhelmingly Protestant subjects deeply uneasy. He began appointing Catholics to high office and claiming the right to suspend laws passed by Parliament, stoking fears that he intended to impose an absolute Catholic-style monarchy on the nation. The breaking point came in 1688 with the birth of a son to the king. Until that moment, the heir to the throne had been the king's Protestant daughter, Mary. And Mary just happened to be married to her cousin, William of Orange. The birth of a male heir created the terrifying prospect of a permanent Catholic dynasty ruling England. For the Protestant elite of England, this was intolerable. In a move of incredible political risk, a group of 7 powerful nobles, both Whigs and Tories, drafted a secret letter. This letter was an invitation to William of Orange, urging him to bring an army to England to intervene, to safeguard the Protestant religion, and to restore the traditional rights of Parliament. For William, this was the opportunity he had been waiting for his entire life. But his motivation was not primarily about gaining a crown for himself or his wife. His decision to accept the invitation was a cold and brilliant geopolitical calculation. He understood that as long as England remained neutral, or worse, a potential ally of France, his grand coalition against Louis XIV would always be vulnerable. If he could bring England and its formidable navy over to his side, the balance of power in Europe would be fundamentally and permanently altered. Taking England was not the prize. Taking England was the means to defeating France. The risk was immense. William began assembling a massive invasion fleet in the Dutch ports, a force far larger than the famed Spanish Armada a century earlier. The endeavor required a huge portion of the Republic's wealth and military resources. He would have to sail in the treacherous autumn weather of the North Sea, and in doing so, he would leave the Netherlands itself dangerously exposed to a French attack. Many in the Dutch government thought the plan was madness, but William's force of will prevailed. In November of 1688, propelled by a favorable Protestant wind that both sped his fleet across the Channel and pinned the English navy in its ports, William's armada landed unopposed at Torbay in the west of England. What followed was less a conquest and more a political implosion. William did not march on London as a conqueror, but advanced slowly, allowing the English political situation to resolve itself. James II's authority crumbled. His leading generals, including the future Duke of Marlborough, deserted to William's side. His support evaporated. Seeing his cause was lost, James II fled to France, effectively abdicating the throne. In England, the entire affair had been almost completely bloodless, a seemingly dignified transfer of power that would go down in English history as the Glorious Revolution. In the aftermath, the English Parliament offered the throne not to William, but to his wife, Mary. She, in a remarkable act of loyalty, refused to rule alone, and so Parliament made them joint monarchs, King William III and Queen Mary II. But their power came with conditions. They were required to accept a new Bill of Rights, a landmark document that forever limited the power of the monarchy, affirmed the supremacy of Parliament, and guaranteed basic civil liberties. It was the foundation of the modern English constitutional state. For William, the result was a complete strategic success. He now commanded the resources of both the Netherlands and England, and he immediately brought his new kingdom into the war against France. For England, the revolution secured their Protestant future and parliamentary government. But for the Dutch Republic, the long-term consequences were more complex. The Glorious Revolution tied the fate of the two maritime powers together. But in this new alliance, the Netherlands was now the junior partner. Over the next century, the center of financial and naval power would slowly but surely shift from the banks of the Amstel to the banks of the Thames. William of Orange, in saving the Netherlands from France by conquering England, had paradoxically set in motion the beginning of the end of the Dutch Golden Age. While William of Orange was playing his high-stakes Game of Thrones in Europe, fundamentally reshaping the political map of the West, the engine room of Dutch power, the great United East India Company, was undergoing its own profound transformation in Asia. For its first century of existence, the VOC had operated on a clear and consistent principle. It was a maritime empire, not a territorial one. Its power was based on the sea. It controlled the shipping lanes from its network of fortified ports: Batavia, Malacca, Colombo, the Cape of Good Hope. The company's directors in Amsterdam were adamant on this point. Ruling over large land territories and native populations was a costly, messy, and distracting business that ate into the profits from trade. The goal was to control the produce, not the people, the ports, not the provinces. But on the island of Java, the very heart of the company's eastern operations, this founding principle was slowly and inexorably beginning to unravel. The VOC's Asian capital, the bustling and heavily fortified city of Batavia, sat on the northwestern coast of Java. But the vast interior of the island was ruled by a powerful and ancient Javanese kingdom, the Sultanate of Mataram. For decades, the VOC and the Sultanate had existed in a state of uneasy and often hostile coexistence. The Dutch were masters of the sea, but the Sultan was master of the land. This balance of power began to change, not through a grand Dutch plan of conquest, but through the endless internal squabbles of the Javanese court itself. The royal politics of Mataram were a complex and often bloody affair, particularly when it came to the issue of succession. When a sultan died, it was common for his many sons, brothers, and cousins to launch into a civil war to claim the throne. It was in these moments of internal weakness that the Dutch found their opportunity. Inevitably, one of the weaker claimants to the throne, desperate for an edge over his rivals, would send a message to the grim, stone-faced governor-general in Batavia, asking for military assistance. For the VOC, this was a tempting offer. The company maintained a small but highly disciplined and well-armed private army, composed mainly of European mercenaries, whose muskets and artillery were far superior to anything the Javanese possessed. To intervene in a civil war was a risk, but the potential reward was enormous, and so a repeating pattern began to emerge, a cycle that would play out again and again over the next century. The company would carefully assess the rival princes, choose the one they believed they could most easily control, and agree to support his claim to the throne. A column of Dutch soldiers would march out from Batavia. Their disciplined ranks and devastating firepower would turn the tide of the civil war, and their chosen candidate would be duly installed as the new Sultan of Mataram. But this help never came for free. The price the company extracted for its services was crippling. In the treaty signed with the new puppet Sultan, the VOC would demand a host of concessions. They would claim a monopoly on the trade of rice or timber from the Sultan's lands. They would demand that the Sultan hand over control of key coastal districts and ports, effectively encircling his kingdom. And most importantly, they would force the Sultan to accept a permanent Dutch garrison at his own court and to acknowledge the VOC as his overlord. Through a series of these Javanese wars of succession in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the once mighty empire of Mataram was systematically hollowed out from the inside. Each intervention left the Sultanate weaker and the VOC stronger. The Javanese kingdom was slowly dismembered, its power drained, until it was eventually partitioned into a collection of small, powerless princely states, each ruled by a prince who owed his throne and his continued existence to the Dutchmen in Batavia. Without ever having a grand strategy of territorial conquest, the VOC had, almost by default, become the true ruler of most of the populous and fertile island of Java. This transformation from a trading company into a colonial government created a deep and troubling dilemma. The VOC was a business designed to maximize profit for its shareholders. It was now saddled with the vast and expensive responsibilities of a state, administering justice, collecting taxes, and maintaining order for millions of Javanese subjects. The company's employees were merchants, accountants, and soldiers. They had no training and little interest in becoming colonial civil servants. Historians still debate whether this was a deliberate long-term strategy of divide and conquer, or a classic case of imperial creep, where the company was reluctantly dragged deeper and deeper into a political quagmire. The letters from the directors in Amsterdam, constantly complaining about the immense cost of these land wars, suggest the latter. The VOC, in its quest for commercial security, had accidentally acquired an empire it did not really want and did not know how to manage. The great trading company was slowly turning, while the VOC was being reluctantly transformed into a territorial ruler in Java. The Dutch Empire in the Atlantic was charting a very different, and in many ways, a much darker course. After the spectacular failure of its Brazilian and North American experiments, the West India Company had consolidated its efforts on a new prize, a territory on the wild coast of South America, acquired from the English at the end of the Second Anglo-Dutch War. In what was seen at the time as a masterstroke of diplomacy, the Dutch had traded away their scruffy, unprofitable fur trading post of New Netherland in exchange for this new possession. The territory they gave away would one day become New York. The territory they received, considered infinitely more valuable, was Surinam. And Surinam's value was derived from a single, intensely desirable, and blood-soaked commodity: sugar. If the VOC's empire was built on the spice trade, the WYK's surviving empire was built on the plantation. Surinam was not a society that had plantations. It was a plantation that had a society attached to it. Its entire existence was geared towards the cultivation of sugarcane in the hot, humid, and disease-ridden coastal swamps. This was agriculture at its most brutal and industrialized. The work was relentless, back-breaking, and incredibly dangerous. It followed a punishing annual cycle, from planting the cane to the frantic harvest, where it had to be cut by hand with machetes and rushed to the mills before the sugar content spoiled. In the mills, workers operated heavy grinding machinery, and in the boiling houses, they toiled in hellish heat over vats of scalding sugarcane juice, a process that went on day and night. This brutal machine required a constant supply of fuel, and that fuel was human beings. The indigenous population was small and quickly succumbed to European diseases, and so the Dutch turned to the transatlantic slave trade, or a business they had already systematically captured from the Portuguese. Dutch ships, controlled by the WYK, would sail to the company's forts on the West African coast, like Elmina Castle. There, they would trade guns, textiles, and alcohol for captured African men, women, and children. These people were branded, shackled, and packed by the hundreds into the dark, suffocating holds of the slave ships for the horrific journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage. The conditions were so appalling that it was common for 15 to 20% of the human cargo to die before the ship ever reached the shores of the New World. Those who survived were marched to the slave markets in Surinam's capital, Paramaribo, and sold like livestock to the highest bidder. Life on the sugar plantations was, for most, a short and miserable existence. The mortality rate was astonishingly high, a result of overwork, malnutrition, and the brutal punishments meted out by the white overseers. The entire colonial society was a rigid and terrifying pyramid, with a tiny elite of white planters and company officials at the very top, and a vast enslaved population, making up over 90% of the inhabitants at the bottom. But the enslaved people of Surinam were not simply passive victims. They resisted their bondage with courage and ingenuity. This resistance took many forms, but the most significant was marronage. The geography of Surinam offered a unique opportunity for escape. Beyond the narrow, cultivated coastal strip lay a vast, dense, and uncharted rainforest. Individuals and groups would constantly risk everything to escape the plantations and flee into the deep interior. There, in the heart of the jungle, these escaped Africans and their descendants forged new, independent communities and new cultures, blending the traditions of their various African homelands. They became known as Maroons. Over decades, they established powerful, self-governing societies, like those of the Saramaka and the Nduka peoples. They became masters of guerrilla warfare, launching raids on the plantations to free relatives and gather supplies. They were so successful and so resilient that after years of costly and failed military expeditions against them, the Dutch colonial authorities were eventually forced to do the unthinkable. They signed peace treaties with the Maroons, formally recognizing their autonomy and freedom. The bitter irony, of course, was that the Dutch, a people who had fought for 80 years to secure their own freedom from what they saw as Spanish tyranny, had constructed one of the most oppressive slave societies in the Americas. How did they reconcile this? The simple, uncomfortable truth is that most did not even try. A complex and monstrous logic of racial dehumanization, combined with the immense profits to be made, allowed them to view the people they enslaved not as human beings with rights, but as a species of property, a form of livestock. And the profits were immense. The sugar, coffee, and cacao produced by this brutal system flowed back to Amsterdam, satisfying the growing European craving for these sweet luxuries and making a small class of planters and merchants fabulously wealthy. But the sweetness of the sugar could never wash away the profound bitterness of the human suffering upon which the entire system was built. The 18th century unfolded under a different sky than the one that had illuminated the Golden Age. The brilliant, luminous light of Vermeer's paintings had given way to a softer, gentler, and more complacent twilight. The Dutch Republic was still immensely wealthy, and Amsterdam remained a major center of finance. But the dynamic, world-beating energy was gone. The long series of debilitating land wars fought as an ally of Great Britain against the France of Louis XIV had taken a heavy toll. This alliance, forged by William III in the Glorious Revolution, had succeeded in containing France, but at a tremendous cost. The Republic had been forced to pour its wealth into maintaining a large standing army to defend its southern border, and in the process, its greatest weapon, the Navy, had been allowed to wither. While the British were building a global empire on the back of the ever-expanding Royal Navy, the Dutch fleet, which had once been the terror of the seas under Admiral de Ruyter, was now a shadow of its former self, its ships aging and its funding cut to the bone. This slow, genteel decline was about to be given a brutal and sudden shock. Across the Atlantic, a new conflict was brewing that would expose the Republic's weakness to the world: the American War of Independence. Officially, the Netherlands was neutral. But for the nation's still powerful merchant class, the conflict was a golden business opportunity. Dutch bankers provided crucial loans to the struggling American rebels, and the small Dutch island of Saint Eustatius in the Caribbean became the key hub for a massive smuggling operation, supplying the Americans with the European guns, ammunition, and supplies they desperately needed to fight the British. The Dutch were playing a dangerous double game, professing neutrality in public while profiting handsomely from the rebellion in private. For Great Britain, this was an infuriating betrayal. They saw their old Protestant ally actively aiding their enemies. The breaking point came when the British captured an American diplomat at sea and found in his possession the draft of a secret treaty of commerce and friendship between the city of Amsterdam and the rebellious American colonies. For the British government, this was all the pretext they needed. They had long been looking for an opportunity to eliminate the Dutch as a commercial rival once and for all. In late 1780, they declared war. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War was not a clash of titans like the wars of the previous century. It was a deeply unequal contest, and for the Dutch, it was an unmitigated disaster from start to finish. The war revealed in the starkest possible terms how far the Republic had fallen. The modern, professional, and vastly superior British Royal Navy swept the seas. They immediately established a crippling blockade of the Dutch coast, strangling the maritime trade that was the very circulatory system of the nation's economy. The port of Amsterdam fell silent. The Dutch Navy, with its fewer, older, and smaller ships, was completely outmatched. Around the globe, the brittle and far-flung Dutch Empire began to crumble. One by one, Dutch colonies and trading posts, left undefended by a non-existent fleet, were picked off by the British. They seized Dutch territories in the West Indies, captured the WIC's forts in West Africa, and even began to dismantle the VOC's holdings in India. The wealthy smuggling port of Saint Eustatius was captured and sacked with particular relish by a British admiral. There was only one major fleet action in the entire war: the Battle of Dogger Bank in 1781. A Dutch squadron, escorting a convoy, clashed with a British fleet of similar size. The fighting was ferocious and bloody, a throwback to the brutal battles of the previous century. Both sides were heavily damaged, and the battle ended in a tactical draw. But strategically, it was a crushing Dutch defeat. The Dutch ships were so battered that the fleet retreated to its home port and did not dare to venture out again for the remainder of the war. While the battle was celebrated at home with a brief nostalgic flicker of national pride, it only served to confirm that the Dutch Navy was no longer capable of challenging the British for control of the seas. The end of the war, finalized in the Treaty of Paris in 1784, was a national humiliation. The Dutch were forced to cede territory in India to the British, and most damagingly, to grant British ships the right to trade freely in the East Indies, effectively breaking the VOC's centuries-old monopoly in the region. The financial cost of the war was immense, pushing the already heavily indebted state to the brink of bankruptcy. But the psychological cost was even greater. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War had ruthlessly stripped away any remaining illusions of grandeur. It was not the cause of the Dutch decline, but its brutal and undeniable confirmation. The nation that had once humbled England on the Medway was now a second-rate power, its global empire vulnerable, and its naval supremacy a distant memory. The twilight had arrived. The humiliating defeat in the war against Great Britain did more than just cripple the Dutch economy and tarnish its global prestige. It ignited a political firestorm at home. In the wake of the disaster, the Dutch people were engulfed by a profound crisis of confidence. A wave of anger, shame, and introspection swept through the Republic. How had their once mighty nation fallen so low? Who was to blame? This soul-searching gave rise to a powerful new political movement, a coalition of reformers who called themselves the Patriots. They argued that the Republic was rotting from within, and that only a radical overhaul of its archaic and corrupt political system could restore its former glory. The 1780s would become a decade of intense internal strife, a period known as the Patriotentide, when a battle for the very soul of the nation threatened to tear the Republic apart. The conflict pitted two deeply opposed visions of the country against each other. On one side were the Orangists, the supporters of the stadtholder, Prince William V of Orange. This faction was traditionalist, drawing its strength from the landed aristocracy, the professional army, and a large portion of the common populace who held a deep, almost mystical reverence for the House of Orange as the historic defenders of the nation. They believed that a strong hereditary leader was essential for stability. On the other side were the Patriots. This was a much more diverse group, a coalition of disaffected nobles, powerful city merchants who felt shut out of the stadtholder's inner circle, and a vocal and energetic middle class of doctors, lawyers, writers, and ministers. They were children of the Enlightenment, inspired by the ideas of Montesquieu and Rousseau, and they looked with admiration to the new successful republic across the Atlantic, the United States of America. The Patriots' diagnosis of the Republic's ills was scathing. They saw William V as an incompetent and indecisive leader, a quasi-king whose court was a nest of corruption and whose disastrous leadership had led directly to the defeat in the war. They also attacked the very structure of the Republic's government, which had become a rigid oligarchy. In most cities, power was monopolized by a handful of wealthy families who passed down offices among themselves, excluding any new talent. The Patriots demanded a restoration of what they saw as the true Republican values of the nation, an end to the hereditary power of the stadtholder, a reform of the city governments to allow for more citizen participation, and a national revival of civic virtue. The battle began not with bullets, but with words. The late 18th century was the great age of the political pamphlet, and a torrent of essays, poems, and cartoons poured from the printing presses. The most influential of these was an anonymous pamphlet published in 1781 titled Aan het Volk van Nederland, to the people of the Netherlands. It was a fiery and eloquent indictment of the House of Orange from the very beginning of the Republic's history, and it ended with a radical call to action. The people must arm themselves, form their own militias, and elect their own representatives to take back the country. The pamphlet was an overnight sensation, read and debated in homes and taverns across the country. Inspired by this call, the Patriots began to move from theory to practice. All across the Republic, they formed armed citizen militias, which they called Vrijkorpsen, or Free Corps. These militias would drill openly in town squares, wearing their own uniforms and electing their own officers. This was a direct and potent challenge to the stadtholder's authority as the constitutional commander-in-chief of the army. The conflict soon escalated from an armed standoff to a slow-motion revolution. In cities like Utrecht and Amsterdam, the Patriots and their militias grew so powerful that they successfully overthrew the sitting Orangist city councils and installed their own, more representative governments. By the mid-1780s, the Netherlands was effectively in a state of low-grade civil war, with a growing number of Patriot-controlled cities openly defying the central government. The standoff came to a head in 1787. The stadtholder, William V, was a weak and vacillating figure, but his wife, Wilhelmina, was not. She was a Prussian princess, the niece of the great military genius Frederick the Great, and she was a woman of formidable will and intelligence. Determined to rally the Orangist forces, she decided to travel from her palace to The Hague. But her carriage was stopped by a Patriot militia, who politely but firmly refused to let her pass. This seemingly minor incident was the spark that brought the whole edifice crashing down. Wilhelmina wrote to her brother, now the King of Prussia, complaining of the great insult she had suffered. The king, who had been looking for a pretext to intervene, seized the opportunity. In September 1787, a massive Prussian army of 20,000 professional soldiers crossed the border. The Patriot militias, for all their revolutionary fervor, were no match for one of Europe's finest armies. Their resistance collapsed almost immediately. The revolution was over. The aftermath was decisive. The Patriot leaders fled by the thousands into exile, many of them to Paris. The Orangist regime of William V was restored to power, but it was a hollow victory. The stadtholder now ruled not by the consent of his people, but thanks to the bayonets of a foreign army. The Dutch Republic had become a de facto protectorate of Prussia and Great Britain. The first Dutch Revolution had failed, but the ideas it had unleashed of popular sovereignty and democratic reform had not been extinguished. The exiled patriots in Paris were about to witness the dawn of a new, far more radical revolution, and one day they would be back. The Prussian army had successfully crushed the Patriot Revolution, but they could not extinguish the revolutionary idea. The thousands of patriots who fled into exile found a new home in Paris, and there they witnessed the dawn of a far greater and more radical upheaval, the French Revolution. As they watched the Bastille fall and the old order of France being torn down, their hopes for their own country were reignited. They formed a Batavian Legion and attached themselves to the French revolutionary armies, dreaming of the day they would return home in the vanguard of a liberating force to finish what they had started. That day came sooner than they could have imagined. In the brutal winter of 1794, a French revolutionary army, with the Batavian Legion marching alongside it, advanced on the Netherlands. The restored Orangist regime, propped up by Britain and Prussia, was part of the coalition of old monarchies fighting against France. The Dutch prepared to defend themselves using their age-old trusted strategy, the waterline. They made plans to open the sluices and flood the land to halt the French advance, just as they had done to stop the armies of Louis XIV a century before. But this time, nature itself betrayed them. The winter was one of the coldest on record. A deep and unrelenting frost descended upon the Low Countries. The great rivers, the Meuse, the Waal, the Rhine, which formed a natural barrier, froze solid. The water of the defensive floodplains turned to thick sheets of ice. The Republic's greatest defense was rendered useless. The French army, an army of revolution, simply walked across it. The invasion that followed was one of the strangest in military history. There was almost no fighting. As the French advanced, the regime of the stadtholder, William V, simply collapsed. He had no popular support, his army was unmotivated, and in city after city, local patriot committees rose up seizing control of the town halls even before the French soldiers arrived. It was a revolution that followed in the wake of an invasion. Seeing that his cause was utterly hopeless, William V of Orange, the last stadtholder of the Old Republic, gathered his family and fled from the coast, taking a ship into a lonely exile in England. And with his departure, the great Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, the state that had fought Spain for 80 years, dominated world trade, and humbled the navies of England, ceased to exist. It dissolved not with a bang, but with a quiet collective sigh of resignation. In its place, the victorious Dutch patriots, with the full backing of their French allies, proclaimed a new state, the Batavian Republic. This was, in theory, an independent and allied sister republic of France. For the patriots, it was the dawn of a new age. They set about enthusiastically dismantling the old archaic structures of the fallen republic. They drafted a modern constitution, complete with the Declaration of the Rights of Man. They swept away the old provincial privileges and transformed the loose confederation into a modern, centralized, unitary state. But this revolutionary dream came at a heavy price. The French liberators were also conquerors, and they demanded immense payments in gold and soldiers to support their ongoing wars. The Batavian Republic was never truly free. It was a satellite state, its policies and its finances dictated from Paris. As the years passed, the revolutionary fervor in France gave way to the singular ambition of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon grew impatient with the Batavian Republic, which he found too difficult to control and too lax in enforcing his grand economic blockade against Great Britain, the continental system. In 1806, he decided that the experiment in republicanism was over. He dissolved the Batavian Republic and created a new kingdom of Holland. And to rule this new kingdom, he appointed his own younger brother, Louis Bonaparte. The Dutch, who had fired their last king over 2 centuries before, now had a new one imposed upon them by a foreign emperor. But Louis Bonaparte turned out to be a surprising and reluctant king. He took his new responsibilities seriously, making a genuine effort to be a good ruler for his new subjects. He learned to speak Dutch, adopted the Dutch spelling of his name, Lodewijk, and traveled extensively throughout his new kingdom. He became known, with a mixture of surprise and affection, as Good King Louis. He often tried to protect the interests of the Dutch people against the crushing demands of his all-powerful older brother, particularly the continental system, which was strangling the life out of the Dutch trading economy. This loyalty to his new people, however, was seen as disloyalty by Napoleon. The emperor grew furious with his brother for his failure to stop the rampant smuggling to England. In 1810, Napoleon's patience finally ran out. He forced Louis to abdicate his throne, and in an act of ultimate humiliation for the Dutch people, he formally annexed the Kingdom of Holland directly into the French Empire. For the first time in its history, the Netherlands ceased to exist as a country. It was now merely a collection of French provinces, its fate tied completely to the whims of an emperor in Paris. The long, slow twilight of Dutch power had finally descended into a starless night. The annexation of the Netherlands into the French Empire was the final, devastating blow to Dutch independence at home. But the Dutch Empire was a global entity, a vast and scattered network of colonies and trading posts that stretched from the Caribbean to the coast of Japan. while the homeland was paralyzed, held fast in the grip of Napoleon. What was to become of this sprawling overseas enterprise? These colonies were now cut off from their political and economic center, isolated and suddenly vulnerable, and circling them, with the undisputed mastery of the seas, was the one power that stood against Napoleon, Great Britain. For the British, this was an opportunity of historic proportions. With the Dutch now officially part of the enemy French Empire, every one of their colonial possessions was a fair and tempting target. The process of dismantling began with a strange and ambiguous prelude. Remember that the last stadtholder, William Vise, had fled to England in 1795. Now living in exile at Kew Palace and under considerable pressure from his British hosts, he took a controversial step. He wrote a series of circulars which became known as the Kew Letters, and had them dispatched to the governors of all the Dutch colonies. These letters contained a remarkable instruction. The governors were to treat the British forces as allies and to place their colonies under British protection for safekeeping, to prevent them from falling into the hands of the French-controlled Batavian Republic. For the governors in these distant outposts, this was a deeply confusing and divisive order. Should they obey the command of their exiled prince, or remain loyal to the new government in their homeland? Some complied, others resisted, but for the British, the letters provided a convenient and very useful veneer of legality for what was, in essence, a global campaign of military seizure. The most significant and permanent loss was the Cape of Good Hope. The British had long recognized the strategic value of the settlement that the Dutch had so slowly and accidentally built at the southern tip of Africa. It was the vital choke point on the sea road to their own, now far more important, empire in India. A British fleet arrived at the Cape 1795, and after a brief battle, the Dutch governor surrendered. After being briefly handed back to the Batavian Republic during a temporary peace, the British seized it again, this time for good, in 1806. 150 years of Dutch rule in South Africa had come to an end. The small refreshment station that had grown into a sprawling colony of Fryburgers was now the cornerstone of British power in the Southern Hemisphere. The same story was repeated across the VOC's once mighty Eastern Empire. One by one, the great prizes that the company had wrested from the Portuguese over a century earlier now fell into the hands of the British. They seized the Dutch forts on the coast of India. They took control of the hugely strategic port of Malacca. They invaded and occupied the island of Ceylon, securing its valuable cinnamon trade and its world-class natural harbor at Trincomalee. For a time, the British even occupied the mythical heart of the old spice empire, the Banda Islands and the Moluccas, the very source of the nutmeg and cloves that had built the VOC's initial fortune. In the west, the plantation colonies of the Tulip, like Surinam, were also placed under British occupation for the duration of the long conflict. For the two great Dutch trading companies, this global catastrophe was the final death blow. Their trade routes were severed by the Royal Navy, their assets were seized, and their purpose was rendered obsolete. The West India Company had long been a shadow of its former self, but it was in this period that it finally faded into history. And the once colossal VOC, the world's first and arguably greatest multinational corporation, finally met its end. Financially ruined and institutionally broken, the United East India Company was formally dissolved in 1799. its staggering debts, and its remaining possessions, those that had not yet been seized by the British, were nationalized by the Batavian Republic. After nearly 200 years of astonishing success and ruthless efficiency, the great company was gone. And so, while the Netherlands itself was enduring the humiliation of French occupation, its empire was being systematically taken apart by its oldest rival. It was the spoils of a world war, a conflict in which the Dutch were no longer a primary actor, but a pawn in a larger game between Napoleon's land-based empire and Great Britain's sea-based one. When the Napoleonic storm finally passed and the Dutch people regained their freedom, they would emerge into a new and unfamiliar world. Their country would be impoverished, their great trading companies would be gone, their navy a distant memory, and their empire shattered. Many of the colonies would eventually be handed back, but the most vital strategic jewels, the Cape and Ceylon, would remain firmly in British hands. The long era of Dutch global supremacy was well and truly over. The great Napoleonic Empire, which had seemed for a time to be an unstoppable and permanent new order in Europe, was ultimately built on the genius of a single man. And when his judgment faltered, the entire edifice began to crack. Napoleon's catastrophic invasion of Russia in 1812 was the beginning of the end. The destruction of his grand army in the frozen wasteland left him fatally weakened, and across the continent, the nations he had subjugated began to stir. In the Netherlands, which had been suffering for years under French annexation and the ruinous British blockade, the news of Napoleon's defeat was a spark of hope. In the autumn of 1813, as the emperor's power crumbled, a group of Dutch notables in The Hague staged a quiet coup, formed a provisional government, and declared the Netherlands independent once more. The French, their forces needed elsewhere, were pushed out with little resistance. The first order of business for the new government was to decide what form the liberated state should take. The old decentralized republic was seen as too weak and inefficient, a relic of a bygone era. A consensus quickly formed that the nation needed a strong centralized government under a constitutional monarch, and there was only one possible candidate for that role. An invitation was sent to England, to the son of the last stadtholder who had fled nearly 2 decades before. In November 1813, William Frederick, the Prince of Orange, landed on the same beach at Scheveningen from which his father had departed. He was greeted by jubilant crowds as the symbol of national liberation and renewal. The final shape of this new Dutch state, however, would be decided not in The Hague, but at the grand gathering of European powers that convened in 1815 after Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo. At the Congress of Vienna, the victorious leaders of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia set about the colossal task of redrawing the entire map of Europe. Their primary goal was to create a lasting peace by establishing a stable balance of power. And a key part of that strategy was to ensure that France, the source of so much turmoil, would be contained. To this end, they decided to build a series of strong buffer states along France's borders. It was here that the fate of the Netherlands was sealed. The great powers, and particularly Great Britain, felt that the old Dutch Republic, even as a monarchy, was too small and weak to effectively guard France's northern frontier. Their solution was to create a new, much larger, and more powerful state. They decided to merge the territories of the old Northern Dutch Republic with the southern provinces, the former Austrian Netherlands, which roughly correspond to modern-day Belgium and Luxembourg. This new, enlarged entity would be called the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, and the Prince of Orange would be its king. And so, in 1815, William Frederick was inaugurated as King William the first monarch of the House of Orange and the first king of a nation that had famously defined itself for centuries by its very lack of one. This new kingdom was, on paper, a brilliant piece of geopolitical engineering. It was a substantial, medium-sized power with a good industrial base in the south, a strong commercial tradition in the north, and the strategic ports of both Antwerp and Amsterdam. But it was a state created by diplomats for their own convenience, a forced marriage between two partners who had been separated for over 2 centuries and now had almost nothing in common. The union was deeply and fundamentally flawed from its very inception. The North was overwhelmingly Protestant. The South was devoutly Catholic. The North was a nation of merchants, sailors, and financiers, its economy based on maritime trade. The South was a land of farmers and miners, and was at the forefront of the new Industrial Revolution, its economy based on coal and iron. The North spoke Dutch, while the elite and the rising middle class of the South increasingly spoke French. Most importantly, they had spent the last 200 years on opposite sides of a cultural and political divide, and had developed starkly different identities. King William I, though an energetic and well-intentioned ruler, only made matters worse. He was an autocrat at heart, and his policies consistently favored his native north. He made Dutch the official language of government and promoted Protestantism, deeply alienating the powerful Catholic Church and the French-speaking elites of the South. The Netherlands was reborn from the ashes of the Napoleonic Wars, but in a new and unfamiliar form. The old decentralized republic was gone, replaced by a modern, centralized monarchy. And this new kingdom was yoked to a southern partner with whom it shared a border, but little else. The great powers had created the United Kingdom of the Netherlands to serve as a stable bulwark against France. But they had ignored the deep currents of culture, religion, and history. They had built a house on a geological fault line, and it would not be long before the tremors began. The new United Kingdom of the Netherlands, forged in the diplomatic halls of the Congress of Vienna, was a state born into trouble. King William III was an energetic modernizer, but his kingdom was saddled with the crippling debts of the Napoleonic era. Then, in 1830, the unhappy marriage of North and South finally ended in a bitter divorce. The southern provinces, feeling marginalized and culturally oppressed, rose up in the Belgian Revolution, and with the backing of the other European powers, broke away to form the independent Kingdom of Belgium. For the Netherlands, this was a double blow. The state lost its industrial heartland and was now smaller, weaker, and still deeply in debt. In this moment of crisis, the Dutch government and its king turned their gaze eastward to the one great colonial asset they had managed to retain, the vast and fertile island of Java. The colony, they decided, would have to pay. The old VOC model of simply buying spices and other goods from local producers was no longer enough. A new, far more systematic and profitable method of exploitation was needed. The architect of this new method was a man named Johannes van den Bosch, who was appointed Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies in 1830 with one clear mandate: make Java profitable for the motherland. The system he devised was called the cultuurstelsel, a deceptively neutral Dutch term that translates to the cultivation system. On paper, the plan he presented to the king seemed almost enlightened. Instead of paying their land tax to the colonial government in cash, which was often hard to come by, Javanese villages would instead be required to use 1/5 of their communal farmland to grow government-designated export crops. They would also provide the labor to cultivate and process these crops. In return, their tax obligations would be considered fulfilled. But the reality of the cultivation system was a world away from this neat, bureaucratic theory. The crops the government demanded were not for local consumption. They were the great cash crops of the 19th century world market: coffee, sugar, and indigo. And to ensure that the production of these crops was maximized, Van den Bosch built a terrible incentive into his system. Dutch colonial officials and the local Javanese aristocrats, known as the priai, who worked as their intermediaries, were paid a bonus, a cultuurprocent, based on the size of the harvest in their district. The more coffee or sugar their region produced, the richer they personally became. This single, simple mechanism turned the cultivation system into one of the most ruthlessly efficient systems of colonial exploitation in history. A relentless, top-down pressure was applied to the Javanese peasant. The rule about using only 1/5 of the land was almost universally ignored. Local officials, driven by greed, would often demand that peasants use their best, most fertile, and well-irrigated rice paddies for the cultivation of sugar or indigo. The labor requirements were also far more demanding than promised, often requiring more than 100 days of work a year. This took men away from the vital task of cultivating the rice that their own families needed to survive. The system, in effect, combined the worst features of two different worlds: the forced feudal labor of the old Javanese kingdoms with the insatiable profit-driven logic of modern industrial capitalism. For the Netherlands, the result was a staggering financial success. A vast river of wealth began to flow from the fields of Java to the treasury in The Hague. The profits from the cultivation system single-handedly paid off the entire Dutch national debt. They funded the construction of the Dutch national railway system, the improvement of its canals and harbors, and financed the beginnings of Dutch industrialization. King William I himself was a major shareholder and became one of the richest monarchs in Europe. The Netherlands grew rich again on the back of Java, but for the Javanese people, the system was a catastrophe. In the 1840s, as more and more land was diverted from rice to export crops, a series of devastating famines swept through parts of the island, killing hundreds of thousands of people. The system created widespread poverty and misery, locking the Javanese peasant into a cycle of debt and forced labor. This immense suffering, however, took place thousands of miles away and was mostly invisible to the average Dutch citizen. That changed dramatically in 1860 with the publication of a book. An idealistic former colonial official named Eduard Douwes Dekker, writing under the pen name Multatuli, published a novel titled Max Havelaar, or The Coffee Auctions of the Dutch Trading Company. It was a passionate, semi-autobiographical, and searing indictment of the abuses and the profound hypocrisy of the cultivation system. The book was a bombshell in the Netherlands, shocking the conscience of the nation and sparking a fierce public debate. For the first time, the Dutch people were forced to confront the terrible human cost, of their national prosperity. The profits from the East, it turned out, had a very bitter taste indeed. The public outcry in the Netherlands over the novel Max Havelaar and the brutal realities of the cultivation system eventually led to a slow and gradual reform of Dutch policy in the East Indies. But this shift did not mean an end to the Dutch colonial project. In fact, it morphed into a new phase. By the latter half of the 19th century, enriched by the immense profits from Java, the Netherlands was gripped by a new imperial ambition: to unite the entire vast archipelago of thousands of islands, from Sumatra in the west to New Guinea in the east, under direct and undisputed Dutch rule. This process of consolidation, sometimes cloaked in the benevolent language of an ethical policy meant to bring progress to the natives, would require the subjugation of the last remaining independent kingdoms. And the proudest, most powerful, and most fiercely independent of them all was the Sultanate of Aceh, on the northernmost tip of Sumatra. Aceh was not like the divided and weakened principalities of Java. It was a kingdom with a long and glorious history, a major trading power in its own right, grown rich on the world's insatiable demand for black pepper. Its strategic location, commanding the northern entrance to the vital Strait of Malacca, gave it an international importance. But above all, Aceh was a deeply and devoutly Islamic society. Its identity was inseparable from its faith, and its people were renowned for their martial prowess and their unshakable sense of independence. For the Dutch, the existence of a free archer on their doorstep was a source of constant anxiety. They feared that a rival European power, Britain, France, or even the United States, might sign a treaty with the Sultan and establish a naval base there, threatening the main artery of Dutch trade. After a series of diplomatic maneuvers that freed them from an earlier treaty with Britain that had guaranteed Achenese independence, the Dutch finally felt they had a free hand. Using Achenese piracy in the strait and the Sultan's attempts to seek diplomatic support from the Ottoman Empire and America as a pretext, the Netherlands issued an ultimatum and in 1873 launched an invasion. The first Dutch expedition was a textbook example of colonial arrogance and a military catastrophe. The Dutch commanders, overconfident and dismissive of their enemy, expected a quick and easy victory. Instead, their forces were met with ferocious resistance. The Dutch were unable to take the capital, and in a moment of deep humiliation, their commanding general was killed in action. The battered army was forced to withdraw. The defeat sent shockwaves through the colonial establishment and had the opposite of its intended effect. It proved to the Achenese that the Dutch were not invincible and galvanized their will to fight to the bitter end. A year later, the Dutch returned with a much larger and better prepared army. This time, they succeeded in capturing the Sultan's palace and the main city. But they soon discovered a fundamental truth of guerrilla warfare. They had captured a building, not a kingdom. The Sultan, his government, and the heart of the resistance simply melted away into the rugged, jungle-covered interior of the country. And from there they would wage one of the longest, bloodiest, and most determined anti-colonial wars in history. The Aceh War dragged on for decades. The Dutch controlled the main city, which they held in a heavily fortified defensive perimeter. But beyond this line, the countryside belonged to the resistance. The war was not led by the Sultan, but by a network of local hereditary chiefs and, most powerfully, by charismatic Islamic scholars, or ulama. These religious leaders declared the conflict a Perang Sabi, a holy war against the infidel invaders. This transformed the war from a political struggle into a sacred duty, inspiring acts of incredible bravery and fanaticism, and ensuring that the resistance could be passed down from one generation to the next. For years, the Dutch were bogged down, making no progress. The breakthrough finally came from an unlikely source, a brilliant academic, a Dutch scholar of Islam named Christian Snoek Hugronje, spent years studying a Keynesian society and advised the government to adopt a new, far more ruthless strategy. He argued that the secular chiefs could be bought off with promises of wealth and power within the colonial system, but that the religious leaders, the ulama, were irreconcilable and had to be utterly destroyed. Following his advice, the Dutch formed special counterinsurgency units, the Corps Marechaussee. These were small, mobile, and utterly merciless forces that adopted the enemy's own guerrilla tactics, relentlessly hunting down the religious resistance fighters in the jungle. This final phase of the war was by far the most brutal, marked by massacres and a scorched earth policy that finally broke the back of the organized resistance. By 1904, the Sultan had surrendered, and the last major guerrilla bands had been defeated. But even then, sporadic fighting continued for another decade, until the eve of the First World War. The Aceh War had lasted for over 40 years. It had cost the Dutch treasury billions of guilders and the lives of thousands of its soldiers. But the cost for the Achenese people was catastrophic, with estimates of the dead running to well over 100,000. The Dutch had finally achieved their goal of consolidating their empire. But the savage war in Aceh left a legacy of bitterness and a deep scar on the Indonesian soul that would never fully heal. In the first few decades of the 20th century, after the brutal conclusion of the Aceh War, the Dutch colonial empire in the East Indies seemed to have reached its final, most solid, and most permanent form. The entire archipelago was now under the firm control of a vast and efficient colonial bureaucracy headquartered in Batavia. A new generation of Western-educated Indonesians had begun to dream and speak of a future independent nation, a movement of merdeka, or freedom, led by charismatic young intellectuals like Sukarno. But the Dutch colonial authorities saw this as little more than a minor nuisance, a fringe movement to be managed by surveillance and repression. The nationalist leaders were periodically arrested and sent into internal exile on remote islands. For the Dutch, their rule, which had lasted for 300 years, felt like a law of nature, a permanent and unshakable reality. They could not have been more wrong. The entire colossal structure was about to be shattered with breathtaking speed by a storm that would sweep down from the north. In 1940, the Netherlands itself was invaded and occupied by Nazi Germany, a traumatic event that cut the colonies off from their center of power. 2 years later, the storm reached Asia. The Empire of Japan, seeking to secure the vital oil, rubber, and tin of Southeast Asia for its war effort, launched a devastatingly effective invasion of the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch colonial army, the KNIL, along with its small contingent of American, British, and Australian allies, was caught completely off guard. The Japanese forces were better trained, better equipped, and brilliantly led. Within 3 months, the Dutch colonial army had been utterly defeated, and the Governor-General unconditionally surrendered. 3 centuries of Dutch rule were brought to a sudden and humiliating end. The Japanese occupation, which lasted for 3.5 years, was often harsh and brutal for the Indonesian people. But it had one profound and irreversible psychological effect. It completely destroyed the myth of European invincibility. For generations, Dutch power had rested not just on military force, but on the carefully cultivated idea of the inherent superiority of the white man. Now the people of the archipelago watched as a fellow Asian nation swiftly and decisively defeated their European masters. They saw Dutch soldiers being marched off to prisoner of war camps, and Dutch civilians being interned in squalid internment camps. The spell was broken. The aura of prestige and power that had surrounded the Dutch was gone forever. The Japanese, for their own pragmatic purposes, also inadvertently fanned the flames of Indonesian nationalism. Lacking the manpower to administer the vast archipelago themselves, they had to rely on Indonesian civil servants, placing them in positions of authority that had always been denied to them by the Dutch. And crucially, the Japanese released the great nationalist leader, Sukarno, from his exile. They gave him a public platform, allowing him to travel the country and spread his message of Pan-Asian solidarity and anti-Western sentiment. While the Japanese intended to use him as a puppet to support their own war effort, they were in fact providing the perfect incubator for an independent Indonesian state to take shape. For the first time, the nationalists were able to build a widespread network and a coherent vision for the future, right under the noses of an occupying army. In August of 1945, the war ended with a shocking suddenness. After the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered unconditionally. This created a sudden and extraordinary power vacuum in Indonesia. The Japanese were defeated, but the Dutch, having just been liberated themselves from Nazi occupation in Europe, were thousands of miles away and in no position to immediately return. Sukarno and his fellow nationalists recognized this as their one fleeting chance. On the morning of August 17th, 1945, in a simple ceremony at his house in Jakarta, Sukarno read out the Proklamasi, a short and dignified declaration of the independence of the Republic of Indonesia. The Dutch, however, refused to accept this new reality, consumed by a mixture of wounded pride and a desperate belief that they needed the profits of the Indies to rebuild their own war-torn country. They attempted to turn back the clock. They sent their army back to reclaim their colony by force. What followed was a bitter 4.5-year struggle for independence, a brutal guerrilla war that the Dutch called police actions and the Indonesians called their national revolution. But the world had changed. The old-style colonialism of the 19th century was no longer politically acceptable. The newly formed United Nations condemned the Dutch military actions, and the United States, the new global superpower, put immense economic pressure on the Netherlands to negotiate, subtly threatening to withhold the Marshall Plan aid that was vital for Dutch reconstruction. Faced with a determined and resilient guerrilla enemy on the ground and overwhelming diplomatic and economic pressure from the international community, the Dutch finally had to accept the inevitable. At the end of 1949, at a formal ceremony in the Royal Palace in Amsterdam, the Netherlands formally transferred sovereignty to the Republic of Indonesia. After nearly 350 years, the Dutch Empire in the East was over. It had not been a slow decline or a negotiated handover. It had been a stunningly rapid collapse, initiated by a world war and consummated by a revolution. The loss of Indonesia, the great jewel of the Dutch Empire, was a profound national trauma that forced the Netherlands to fundamentally rethink its place in the world. The age of empire was over, and the relationship with the remaining colonial possessions in the Atlantic had to change. The violent struggle for Indonesian independence had shown that the old ways were no longer tenable. In 1954, in a major constitutional reform, Suriname and the cluster of islands known as the Netherlands, Antilles, were no longer colonies, but were made constituent countries, theoretically equal partners with the Netherlands itself within a single kingdom. But this was a halfway house on the inevitable road to full independence. For Suriname, that moment came in 1975. Unlike the violent birth of Indonesia, the decolonization of Suriname was a negotiated and peaceful process. In fact, by the 1970s, it was the Dutch government in The Hague that was actively pushing for Suriname to take its independence, eager to close the final chapter of its colonial history. The process, however, was fraught with anxiety and internal division. Surinamese society was a complex mosaic of different ethnic groups, the descendants of enslaved Africans, of indentured laborers from India and Java, and others, and many feared that a newly independent state would be dominated by one group over the others. This uncertainty about the future led to a remarkable and transformative event. In the years just before and after independence, nearly a third of the entire population of Suriname chose to leave their homeland and migrate to the Netherlands. This massive wave of migration fundamentally and permanently changed the character of Dutch society itself. The end of empire forced a difficult reckoning within the Netherlands. For centuries, the Dutch identity had been inextricably linked to its status as a global maritime power. To suddenly become just a small, prosperous, but ultimately provincial European nation was a difficult adjustment. At first, many preferred not to look back too closely at the darker chapters of their imperial story. The violence of the colonial wars, the brutality of the slave trade, and the exploitation of systems like the cultivation system were often shrouded in a kind of collective amnesia. But in recent decades, that has begun to change. A new generation of Dutch citizens, many of them descendants of those who came from the former colonies, has spurred a powerful and often painful public debate about the legacy of empire. Statues of old colonial heroes like John Peter Zoon Cohen are now sites of protest, and museums are working to tell a more complete and honest story of the nation's past. And so the great, sprawling enterprise of the Dutch Empire finally dissolved, leaving behind a complex and often contradictory legacy, a faint echo that can still be found all over the world. It can be heard in the Afrikaans language of South Africa, a direct descendant of the Dutch, spoken by Van Riebeck's settlers. It can be seen in the gabled architecture of Old Batavia, now Jakarta, or in the historic port of Willemstad in Curaçao. Its memory lives on in the place names of a city the Dutch held for only a few decades: Brooklyn, Harlem, and the Bowery in New York. The financial world we live in today, a world of stock markets and multinational corporations, was born in the noisy courtyard of the Amsterdam Beurs to fund the voyages of the VOC. The story of the Dutch Empire is a story of paradox. It is the story of a people who fought heroically for their own freedom from an empire, and then went on to build a vast and often brutal empire of their own. It is the story of a society that produced the sublime, light-filled art of Vermeer and the groundbreaking science of Leeuwenhoek, while profiting from the deep darkness of the slave trade and the plantations of Suriname. It was an empire born of a revolutionary idea of republican liberty, yet sustained by an utterly ruthless pursuit of commercial monopoly. It is a story of human ingenuity and human cruelty, of pragmatism and greed, of great beauty and profound suffering. A story of a tiny, waterlogged nation that, for a brief and brilliant moment, rose to command the trade of the entire world, leaving a permanent mark on the shape of the globe we inhabit today. And now, the long voyage is over. The fleets have returned to port, and the great story has been told. The echoes of the cannons have faded, and the clamor of the trading houses has fallen silent. All that is left is the quiet of the present moment, a time for rest. Let the complex currents of history settle, and allow the gentle tide of sleep to carry you toward a peaceful shore. Wishing you the deepest rest and the most tranquil of dreams.